Call the meeting to order. It is 1:38, Wednesday, October 16th. This is the State Board of Education. And we can start, Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind, with the roll call.
Mohammed Joe.
Here.
Ray Barron.
I'm here.
Kim Gleason.
Here.
Caleb Greenwood.
Here.
Tammy Colby.
Present.
Lyle Jepson.
Here.
Tom Love.
Here.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Here.
Rich Warner. Jennifer Deck Samuelson.
Here. Thank you. Good afternoon.
And Secretary Saunders.
So thank you. I believe Interim Secretary Saunders will be joining us. She was at a press conference, and Rich, I believe, will be remote today. He had something earlier this morning. Before we get started, are there any amendments to the agenda? Hearing none, I just want to take a moment and thank, we are at Essex High School today, and I want to thank everyone here. We started with the tour this morning of both the CTE Center as well as the school generally, and had a terrific tour led by students and administrators. So thank you very much for hosting. I also want to acknowledge Suzanne and Maureen, Suzanne especially for the many, there was a lot that happened behind the scenes to get us to today, so thank you very much, and Kim as well. Thank you. So we are
Essex folks who helped us navigate a very busy building and a very important meeting. So.
And we're here today really to honor Kim, who will be leaving us in February. This is kind of our last good opportunity to be in person to honor you and your service. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
But we will save it until February to do the official
of course.
recognition.
It's just fun to feel a little bit back home. This has been, a special place, bringing 4 kids through it and spending time on the board here. So it's very fun to be able to share this place with all of you. Thanks for coming.
So with that, are there any members of the public who wish to be heard? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. So we have a resolution for Jeff Francis, who is the outgoing Vermont Superintendent Association Executive Director. But Tammy, I will leave it to you to.
Thanks. Thanks. So we wanted to take a few minutes to acknowledge the incredible contributions by our colleague and friend Jeff Francis, who can wave to everybody if you don't know Jeff, who's with us here today. I'm going to share a few overarching remarks, but then Kim's going to read a resolution on part of the board. And I wanted to share a few remarks really personally with Jeff, because when we set out to write this resolution, I sent little notes around and said, give us some ideas about things to say in a resolution. And Jeff, the emails just poured in. And I will share them with you. And they were just incredible. Right, exactly. But these incredible reflections on a storied career over 30 years in Vermont public service, in particular as sort of the head of Vermont Superintendents Association, and just the stories and the appreciation for the work that he did. And things along the line, comments along the lines of clear-headed, right, compromise, moral compass, friend, colleague, supporter, leader, policymaker. Those are really powerful words. And, coming from your colleagues and friends around the state, we wanted to take just a moment today, again, to honor you, to thank you for your public service. You truly have been a public servant, and everything you've done for public education in the state. So with that, we have a resolution to read, and I'll let Kim read it.
Thank you. Whereas Jeff Francis has served the public interest in Vermont beyond the realm of education, having served as Secretary of Commerce and Rockingham Town Manager, his service was always guided by his core beliefs of equity, excellence, and support for public good. Whereas Jeff led Vermont superintendents as Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association for 28 years, he was an ever-present supporter, mentor, and advocate, bringing an impactful voice for public education and its educational leaders in the field to decision makers and policymakers in Montpelier. Whereas Jeff was a trusted colleague among the education leadership organizations, Vermont School Boards Association, Vermont Principals Association, and Vermont NEA, Jeff deeply understood the power of collaboration to raise a collective voice for public education, sharing an example of civility and compassion in pursuit of common good. Whereas Jeff was inspired to enter public service by his father's example, and throughout his career, Jeff has inspired the next generation. He earned a reputation for exceptional mentorship of students and young professionals in Vermont, and was a constant champion of student voices. Whereas Jeff earned respect from all groups of educators, educational leaders, policymakers, and legislatures for his accuracy and clarity, especially giving thoughtful and level-headed guidance, even with the most controversial conversations. Whereas policymakers relied on Jeff to provide them with well-reasoned and supported, insightful messages. Fueled by tenacity and grit, Jeff has deeply impacted the Vermont education system and will be truly missed by policymakers. Whereas Jeff shared his wit and wisdom while endeavoring to be brief, and students, families, and the Vermont education community benefited from each opportunity to learn from his brevity. Whereas Jeff is a tireless advocate for public education at the keystone of democracy, fighting for equity, rigor, and efficiency for all Vermont students. Be it therefore resolved that the State Board of Education bestows its appreciation and commendations to Jeff Francis for his service and dedication to the state of Vermont, and furthermore extends its gratitude for the support and guidance he generously shared with the State Board of Ed over many years. Dated this 16th day of October 2024, State Board of Education, and signed by Jennifer. Thank you.
I'll endeavor to be brief.
I may have written that statement.
First of all, this comes as a surprise to me. I learned about it the night before last. I'm deeply touched. When I came in, Suzanne said, one more time, I want to ask you to sign in. So I signed Jeff Francis, and then I wrote the word unaffiliated. And I am no longer affiliated with the Superintendent's Association, having left my position there on August 2nd. I'm doing a little bit of work with them until the end of December. But we recently had a retirement celebration that was populated by many, many educators from around Vermont. And the purpose of that, in my mind, was to extend gratitude to those of us and those of you who have made a commitment to public education in the state. I think that it is among the most important, if not the most important, public service. I didn't come to it as an educator myself. As was indicated, I worked as a town manager at the outset of my career. I worked in the administration of Madeline Cunin. I did a stint with the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. And in 1996, I was fortunate to have been hired by the Superintendent's Association. And I like to think that I was at least hired in part because of an interview that I had had with David Larson, who at the time was the chair of the House Education Committee. He later went on to become the chair of the state board and did a stint himself as the interim superintendent. And I asked him, because I didn't have much context for the public education delivery system at that point, how he thought of superintendents, which was the position that I was applying for, the executive director for the Superintendent's Association. And he said, at their best, superintendents are pragmatic visionaries. And I went to my interview with that phrase in my head and used it at least once. I may have used it more than once, because I both thought it was how superintendents, and I would add parenthetically school leaders, should be approaching their work. And for the 28 years that I worked for the Superintendent's Association, I tried to keep that notion of pragmatic visionary at the front of my own thought process, along with the phrase public service. So, you know, many of you know me in different capacities. I think largely I have been a cooperative and collaborative participant in the education delivery system. There have been times when I was standing on principle, found myself in what I would consider mild disagreements or controversies or healthy debate. And that's part of what a democratic society is supposed to do. So now here I am, really as the last official act that I'm going to participate in, being honored with this resolution by the State Board of Education. And for that, I say thank you. I have sincere gratitude for not only democracy, but for the institution of public education and all of those folks who contribute to it. And you are among that group. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service. I both lament the fact that I'm leaving at this time and also celebrate the fact, because I would say in the entirety of my career, and it was bookended by Act 60, which was enacted in 1997, and the really critical endeavor that we're all engaged in, or you're all engaged in right now with regard to honoring principles of equity, but doing so in a highly efficient manner and modernizing not only the public education system itself, but the way public education is organized. And I think that that is an essential task that has been worked on ad nauseum for years. And I believe we're at a moment in history where this is our best opportunity because of the interest to get it right. So those are the formal, off the top of my head comments that I wanted to make to you. Thank you for the opportunity to do that. And finally, I would be remiss if I too didn't add my congratulations to Kim Gleason, because I did not put two and two together with respect to the proximity of the meeting today, but it makes absolute sense to me, because Kim has been a stalwart in support of public education, not only for the state, but most specifically where it started for her, which is in this community. And Kim, as much as I'm appreciative of being invited here today to hear these very, very heartwarming remarks, I'm here now with a real acknowledgement of the service that you've contributed. And if I had known to put two and two together, then my now remarks that have gone on too long would even be a little bit longer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
I think you've been a phenomenal leader, and thank you all members of the State Board and all the contributors from the Agency of Education for the work that you do.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Honored to learn and work alongside you. VSBA, VSA, you know, we're all better for your wisdom.
Very, very humbled by this.
Free for otherwise.
Thank you
I'll
all.
send you the emails.
Okay, take care.
Hey Jeff, can I have a picture with you, Jeff?
Excuse me?
Is it okay if we have a picture?
Oh, sir.
Oh, that's a great idea.
My least favorite thing is
Come on, everybody get in the
picture,
picture.
but for this special occasion, I'll be happy to do it.
Ready?
We should do everybody. Come on in, everybody.
I usually try to stand in the back row. but
You might not. I mean, you've got a tall spot. I don't think you get to stand in the back row at all.
Here, who's got a phone?
Will you share one?
Is that your phone, Peter? You'd send that to me. Peter and I are good
All right,
friends.
let's start with him, then we'll go to.
Thank you.
All good? Say Hornets.
Hornets. Little Hornets.
All right, then over this one. 1, 2, 3.
Hornets. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Okay, bye-bye. Thanks. Good to see you, Tom.
Peter used to work with the agency of ed, if I'm recalling correctly, and Cole was a student when my kids were here, and he was our other photographer. And he was an exceptional athlete and just simply an amazing music guy as well. So, no, thank you guys. All right.
Okay, so this brings us to the approval of a couple of minutes from prior meetings. The first are the retreat meeting minutes from August 21st, 2024. And with that, we also have the photocopy of the sticky notes and the white paper that Tammy took notes on, as well as Jenna transcribed everything, so it's typewritten if that's an easier format. Thank you. So with that, I will entertain a motion to approve the retreat meeting minutes from August 21st, 2024.
So moved.
All right, moved by Lyle, a second.
Second.
Seconded by Gray. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving our meeting minutes from retreat meeting minutes from August 21st, 2024, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Tom will abstain because he was not there. Okay. Moving on, I will entertain a motion to approve our meeting minutes from September 18th, 2024.
So moved.
Moved by Tom,
I'll second.
seconded by Tammy. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving our meeting minutes for September 18th, 2024, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? I think it's unanimous. All right, thank you. Next, board announcements, just a couple of things that I've got. One is I've heard back now from a couple more of you about taking the Code of Ethics training. Just a reminder that we all need to take it. So if you have lost the email with the link, I'm happy to resend it. But when you take it, at the end of it, you get a certificate that should be sent to Maureen and Suzanne with a copy to me, just so that I know. And then I will stop reminding everyone about it. Also, in the agenda packet, you guys might recall last month we received some public comment from members of the public with regard to open meeting law, executive session, transparency. So those were emails that had been shared with the board before that I had previously responded to. So just to close off that loop, I included those responses in the agenda packet, just for everyone's information. Also, I just wanted to let everyone know that we had discussed at our meeting last month the idea that the agency was going to be sharing with us the technical assistance forms for independent schools. We all got those about a week and a half ago. And then board members were given a week to email responses or questions to me that I then forwarded on to the agency last Friday. I've heard that the plan is to have responses prepared for the board, and this should be on our November meeting agenda. And then the last thing that I have to announce is that Erin McGuire is on our agenda for 2:20, but I believe she can't really come until 2:30, so we might have to shift things around just to kind of have her come in at 2:30. So depending on how long everything else takes, we'll move things around.
Can I ask
Yes.
one question? On the materials from the AOE, is there anything outstanding? I know that there was one additional report on tuition paid for the school year July 1, 23 to June 30, 24 to independent schools, and I haven't seen that come through yet.
So every email that I got from board members, I actually forwarded it straight on. And so
it wasn't one of the questions, it was one of the original requests for materials. So I was
Okay.
just wondering, that wasn't in the material.
okay, I think that, if I'm remembering correctly, that was batched with the questions.
Okay.
So that it wouldn't, because I only sent that email on Friday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If they have it ahead and it can be shared, because I'm sure it's probably a run it kind of thing versus a respond to it interpretation. That would be
Okay.
great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other board announcements?
I think I have one. Just wanted to let you know that I've been invited to present at a conference happening on the 25th at Fairleigh, Lake Maury, by the VSBA to present about accessibility of board meetings so that we or any board meeting can become more inclusive in their meetings. So if you're going to be there, you will see me there. If not, you're welcome to join.
I know Rich is planning to be there, but would you be willing to give us a report back? next month?
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
I think I am going to also attend just on Friday. Carrie Lamb will be moving out of the area, and she has been the manager for the VSBA for so many years. And from my time with her, I know they plan to honor her on Friday. And I also thought the content around engagement on Friday seemed amazing. So I'm going to go up for the day as well.
Awesome. Look forward to seeing you.
All right. If there's nothing further, we can move on to the staff report. Although, Gray, do you want to take a minute? All right, well, I'll turn it to you first.
Yeah, I'm a little sick right now, hence all the coughing. Things that are happening at our school. It's a busy time, especially for seniors. So most of my things right now are very senior focused. You know, deadlines for applying to colleges are coming up for lots of seniors. Some people in our class are already committed to colleges. Others are working on the final stages of their essays. I'm the treasurer for my class. I'm one of the 4 people in our class officer group. So we're trying to work on focusing planning all the things for the year that we'll do as seniors, and so we have lots of class meetings and stuff. We have a walkathon coming up actually that the senior class does, and this is a pretty long-standing tradition in our school, I think 15 or 20 years now, where the senior class votes on a charity that they want to walk for. We voted on the Wounded Warrior Project this year, and then we set a walking course. It's like 18 miles or so, and then our whole day, so for us it's going to be next Thursday, is we go out and we walk the route, and then we have people sponsor us, and we have a goal and stuff like that. And it's just it's a big thing for the senior class, and has been for a long time. So I'm happy to help plan that. And then there are lots of other events that we're just kind of seeing if people want to do. As seniors, we plan winter ball. We've talked about doing like a senior sunrise activity or a senior movie night, or just other things to try to, now that we have to can focus less on fundraising as opposed to past years where it's just fundraising the entire year, we're able to do a lot more things with the class. So I think that's a really neat thing. And then in terms of larger school discussions, 2 things come to mind. One is there's a lot of talk about scheduling in our school. And it's been announced by the principal, and it was announced at our school board meeting this Monday that 100% of the schedule is going to change because they're not happy with how it is right now. And there is going to be a group put together of a combination of students and teachers to try to work on what we think the schedule should look like, which ironically I won't be able to attend because it doesn't fit in my schedule. Yeah, that's called the Navigators. Everything's nautical themed because our mascot is the Commodores. So that we'll see how that goes. But certainly at the school board, it was a big topic. Currently, how we do things is we have large block schedules, like 75-minute classes. We have 4 classes. It's the same class every day. We don't have an alternating schedule. Every day for a semester, new classes besides AP classes every day the next semester, which is how we've done it the past 2 years. And then and then how we previously did it was like a revolving AB schedule, where we have different classes on different days. And that's what a lot of people are talking about going back to, but there's schedule changes every year. And then the other big concern at our school right now is phone policy. There's a lot of talk about phone policy. At our school board meeting, we talked about a potential VSBA resolution around looking into forcing school boards to have, some sort of phone policy and put it out there. Our current, basically each year, some new policy comes out from our school about cracking down on the phones, and it always works to dubious effect. this year, it's in theory that we're not allowed to be on our phones, students or teachers, for any reasons, 8 to 3 o'clock. And there's a lot of talk, and the superintendent announced too on Monday that we're in the process of purchasing some sort of lockable bag, and that every person has to put their device in the bag, and the bag has a lock for the entirety of the school day, which at least most students are not a fan of, which isn't surprising, but it has mixed reactions in the community. So, yeah, that's everything for me.
All right. Building off of Gray's sickness, I too have been going through it for the past couple weeks, but I'd like to give a quick shout out to North Country. As many people know, they've been fighting the PCBs, as many other schools have, but just this week they've been allowed to continue most classes back in the regular school building. So that's great, right before winter. And ironically, some students are actually not happy about it, because many of them enjoyed being able to move, not just staying in one building the entire day, being able to go out into the tents, like right in front of the school, or going to the Legion next to the school, being able to move around, kind of similar to like a college campus, how that would function. That's similar to how they were for these past couple weeks. And so some students enjoyed that. So we'll see how these next weeks go as they're adapting and getting back into the flow of things. But one announcement at my school that we learned 2 board meetings ago that I forgot to bring up in our last meeting is that our principal will be getting done at our school. So I'd also like to give a shout out to him, Mr. Messier. You know, we're all big fans of him. Yeah. He's been great at our school. He handles it very well. He builds bonds with everyone. So, yeah. And our school has also been going through some schedule changes. So our schedule, as I was telling Gray, is very, very intricate, and there's a lot of little details that go into it. But the biggest problem has been on the first day of the week, where we have 80-minute blocks, first, second, third, fourth, but in between the second and third block are 2 40-minute blocks, which are lunch and advisory, which switch depending on your grade level. And the biggest problem with those 2 is that students didn't have enough time to eat before their next class. So they ended up having to extend those lunch blocks by removing, I think it was 5 to 10 minutes from each block to add extra time. Because especially in the second lunch block, there would be students who wouldn't even have gotten their lunch yet, and their classes were already starting. So that was a big problem, but that's handled pretty well. My personal announcements are just like things that are happening. I'll be touring a couple colleges next weekend down in Boston, or this coming weekend. So I'm excited for that. Yeah, that's about it.
Thank you.
Have you had any luck with the master calendar that you were talking about at the last?
Yeah, so I've been starting to get people in my school involved with that, and I would like to thank Jennifer for referring Burn Burke to me. They have a very, very interesting calendar system that I admire. It's very similar to what I would like, because you're able to filter it, especially focusing academic things, because something I've heard a lot about is students not knowing what to do to get prepared for college or secondary education. Like, for example, programs such as Upward Bound to VSAC, etc. There was one of my mother's friends who she took photos of, didn't do very well her freshman year. It was her COVID year. And she didn't know about any of those programs. She was a first-generation college student. And so she built back up her her high school resume. And so once it got to her senior year, she didn't even start looking at colleges, doing anything until now, because her school just didn't educate her very well. So something like this calendar, or even just announcements in schools, I think could help a lot in secondary education and how we could help students get there. Or not even necessarily secondary education, but their goals, even if they just want to go into the workforce, finding a suitable place for them and what they might enjoy.
That's a great point.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I'm going to clap for Winooski. We're good at doing that. As a matter of fact, We have organized an event happening on the 26th of this month. That is for seniors and their parents, and just to learn about what's ahead and how to get there. And then next month we have another one that would include flexible pathways and career readiness and such. So yeah, good point.
I wonder, in thinking about your interest in this being a more globally well-applied concept of preparation, I do remember like going to something even as a parent when I think my oldest and probably all of them were like juniors, the beginning of the junior year, to start to really understand even as a parent, especially the first time around. And then subsequently I remember a couple of my kids coming back to do a student panel that was like 1 year out. What do you wish you knew? Like, what were the things that were most helpful in you deciding where you were going? So it's so interesting to think about what might that look like if we, statewide, were a better understanding of some of the practices currently employed, and how might, I wonder if like guidance counselors in their network are able to share the resources they have. But I love this continued interest in like streamlining and aligning some of the best practices that are happening. And we heard our students say when we were in the guidance lobby, when they were doing our tour, they're like, oh, I feel so well prepared. They were like getting their little reminder notes or whatever. I remember not having, I remember my feeling as though my students felt well supported, because the first time around as a parent, you don't know anything, and helping your students figure this out. So it seems like a wide range, as is the case in a lot of things in Vermont. But I love your focus on it, because it might be another area to see what are the statewide resources that might help that be more similar school to school. I'm sure it's every school district's goal that students feel supported when they're going on to whatever their next thing is. But you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's great.
Other comments or questions for Gray or Caleb? Gray, I guess my one question for you with the walk for the Wounded Warrior is the walk itself 18 miles, and like everyone who's doing it is walking the 18 miles?
Yeah.
Is there like an opportunity to run, or is it just walking?
There is. That's how it's traditionally done. We unfortunately scheduled it for 2 days before states, so I'm not gonna do an 18-mile run.
It'll be a walk.
Yeah.
It'll probably be a walk. Maybe I'll run some of it just for fun. But, yeah.
That's great.
How many people will participate?
It's open to the whole senior class. Not everyone in the senior class will be there, but any senior that's going to school that day will walk.
Awesome.
I mean, I suppose you could choose to do class instead, but it's typically like at least 50 people, which is most of our grade.
That's great.
All right. Thank you both.
We'll be right back. I need to find a box of tissues.
All right.
There's also water, I think probably still, Suzanne, in that room.
Okay, so the next item on our agenda is just to finish off the review of board committees and memberships that we got about 90% through at our last meeting. So I just have a couple little cleanup items. One is just a forecast to retire the Education Quality Standards Committee. So that was, we created that at our December 15th, 2021 board meeting, and it was tied to intaking recommendations received from the Act 1 Advisory Group to inform our rulemaking, which was completed this summer. So my proposal is that we retire that committee. We've already stood up the Student Performance Standards Committee, which is the next iteration of that work, comprised of the same members. So at this point, I would entertain a motion to retire the Education Quality Standards Committee that was created by the State Board of Education at its December 15th, 2021 meeting. Is there a motion?
I'm wondering if you would want to include in that and work charged to the EQS committee is directed to the performance standards, because I'm remembering the motion that charged the IRIS, the social equity standards, and that work was sent to EQS.
Although we resent it last month to the
Okay,
Student
so
Performance
we got
Standards
it,
Committee.
okay.
We did get it, yeah.
Okay.
And then, so the motion from last month was we sent it to the Student Performance Standards Committee
Okay.
and then asked them to come back to the full board with recommendations.
Got it. Okay.
So I'll make that motion.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
I
Any opposition? Any abstentions?
I'll abstain. I missed what we're voting on.
All right. Thank you. Okay, and then two other things, just to make it clear. The Student Performance Standards Committee will be comprised of Tammy and Kim, Mohammed and Gray. So we had a quorum issue, and Rich has agreed to step off the committee for now. So Tammy, Kim, Mohammed, and Gray will be Student Performance Standards Committee. And then the CTE Update Committee. Once we get a draft from the agency, we've established that committee, and it will be comprised of Lyle, Tammy, Tom, and Rich. So that's that. And I'm just looking, it's,
Let me ask a question.
yes.
So historically, all this down. Historically, the state board has had a legislative affairs committee, and if we go back to, I think, two iterations of chairs, there was this committee, and it was stood up. Where does that committee fit in our existing structure? It's never been retired. It's just it isn't constituted at the moment.
Yeah, I don't know, and I haven't had a chance to go back and look at the minutes, because I know that John Carroll sort of disbanded the committee or stopped the committee, but I haven't had a chance to.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to look at it in the Roles and Responsibilities
okay.
Committee.
Okay.
The concept, I think, makes really good sense to help if you or whomever's being asked to testify know sort of the framework and have a quick response team to know the question and vet the common understanding of the board. I think it feels, if one were to be called to speak, supportive of that. And the legislature moves so quickly that the month-to-month meetings probably aren't adequate to have a fully informed position. So I would strongly advocate for that. I think I noticed that even the Essex Westford Board now has a legislative committee. It's a good practice, I think, to stay on top of what's happening and be able to offer informed testimony.
So we can add that to our next Roles and Responsibilities Committee meeting.
Okay. Speaking of, I'm going to skip ahead. So we're going to hold off on item H until Aaron is able to join us. I'm going to go ahead and move on to item J, which is an update from the Roles and Responsibilities Committee. So this is just a brief update. The committee had its second meeting on October 7th. So this is Mohammed, Jenna, Tammy, and I are on that committee. We reviewed 16 VSA Section 164, which lays out the board's statutory duties and authorities, and went through and identified whether the board was meeting the duties as outlined in statute, and for those items that we are not meeting, what would it take for us to be able to meet it? So for instance, I believe it's Section 164, subparagraph 18, we are supposed to have a strategic vision. We don't have a strategic vision. We are not really equipped and supported to have to do that work. So we had a conversation about what would it take for us to be able to do that. And the goal of the committee is to put together a budget and submit it. I think the deadline is the week of November 4th. That is actually budget discussions are happening right now, so we're kind of on the late end of things, so this has become a high priority to the extent that we need additional monetary support or support staff to help us, or a consultant, or whatever that looks like, but to put together a proposal and submit it in time. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think it was a great conversation. I think the other thing we did that we're going to take up at the next meeting is we went through all the rules and looked at the last date they were updated. Many of them are decades old. And as a part of this effort, giving serious consideration to the resources that it'll take to bring our rules up to date. And that's, we've had great effort around EQS, we've done the independent school rules, we're now taking on CTE, but there's another whole body of rules that some of which have not been touched since 1996. So there's both an intent and an effort to figure out a strategic plan for how we would sort of take those on, which are going to be a priority, which of those we might need additional counsel or technical assistance to update, and things along those lines. So that's also the, part of what we've been working on.
I'm remembering too that document from May with those last updates and things like that, it's conceivable that some of them are just irrelevant because
Yes.
those parts of law no longer exist.
We
So
need to-
there might be like a mass deletion as opposed to having
Updating.
the overwhelming consideration of having to update all, because I don't know what the mechanism would be for that, but as you guys think about it, it would be awesome to look at what our options might be if we find that some are just no longer relevant, and how quickly could those be gone.
Yep, I think that's, what do we keep, what needs to go, what needs to be revised, right? All needs to be part of that, but if you think about it, sort of the regulatory canon, right, are the rules, and that's what school principals pick up when they need to figure out how to do their work. And so it's really important that those rules and that regulatory framework reflects our current policy infrastructure as well as our priorities, and provides with, a crisp response to important questions that people have. So I think that's going to be a priority for the state board over the next, several months and maybe a year, to try to go through those rules and update them. And again, to Kim's point, consider where do we need to drop things, where do we need to add things, where do we need to revise things.
I don't know if the Secretary of State's process, the ICAR, LCAR process, how that actually navigates things like a deletion of a small slate because they don't exist in statute anymore. So that'd be a curious question that might
With Rules
give us
Series
a legal
7,000, we had to go through.
You still had to file open
We
comment.
did. It was very short.
Yeah.
That was one of those things where I think we opened and closed it in well under the 8 months.
Yeah.
But you do still have to go
Yeah.
through it.
And it might, if that's the case, benefit from being sure we've got everything we need on the same slate, because that process could open and close more quickly.
It's going to be really important that we handle the canon of rules
Yeah.
as a body of work, because these rules talk to each other,
Yeah.
right? And we need to look at this very holistically. Again, holistically in terms of how they interact, but holistically in terms of the existing policy frameworks and statute, right? And making sure that all of these things work together. We've had a lot of substantive changes in statute over the last 10 to 15 years. Those substantive changes in many instances are not reflected in the rules. And so we have statute and rules right now, they're actually in conflict with one another. So it's going to be really important for the state board to sort of update this body of work so that we have sort of policy coherence across the board.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. And forgive me for not knowing, is this Erin?
It is.
All right.
Yes.
You are just in time.
Great. That's the goal.
All right, so we are just going to turn back to agenda item H, and we are joined by Erin McGuire, who's the Director of Special Education and Equity. And Kim had a suggestion about inviting Erin to talk to us about the equity journey that Essex Westford underwent to get to where they are today. So thank you.
Great, thank you. So, hi everyone. It is good to see those of you I know for a very long time. And nice to be with those of you who I don't. I am Erin McGuire. I hold a couple of different roles here at Essex Westford School District. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion. And I also am the co-director of Student Support Services. So I oversee special education, disability services, and supports for students with my co-director. I'm the Title IX coordinator for the school district, and I also oversee HHB, hazing, harassment, bullying, and retaliation practices in the school district, social work services, nursing services, a myriad of different topics. But today I'm here to talk with you a little bit about the equity journey of EWSD and where we've been, where we are, and how that is related to state practice, as well as district, and then all the way down into the school. So today I hope to talk with you a little bit first about the state policies that have informed our work, and then move into a conversation about where we are, and then get to the point where I can talk a little bit about school implementation of those practices so that we can really draw that through line all the way from statewide down into district and then into local school practices. I wanted to begin just by, you may have heard this already as you have entered our school system, but our vision, which is growing hearts and minds for a better today and tomorrow, every day, every way, everyone. That was a vision that was written at the inception of EWSD as a school district, a merged school district under Act 46. And was an incredibly robust community process with lots of student voice and community voice to help us get here. And I hope that in that every day, every way, everyone, you can see the initial framework of the vision of equity for EWSD. State policy has played a really important role as we've thought about our equity journey. And what I just wanted to note first is that Vermont has a long history of anti-discrimination law as it relates to education practice, and that comes in the form of HHB, the hazing, harassment, bullying, special education frameworks are part of that journey, Title IX, the American with Disabilities Act, thinking about public accommodations and others, and really ensuring that we have a non-discriminatory environment in which to build education practices in Vermont. And I also just wanted to take note of the education quality standards that will go into effect in 2025 and the purpose statement that exists in the front of those, which includes that those are present to afford educational opportunities that are substantially equal in quality and are equitable. They are anti-racist. They are culturally responsive. They are anti-discriminatory and inclusive. And I think just wanted to make note of the difference between a non-discriminatory environment that manages that through recognition of discrimination and addressing discrimination when found versus creating comprehensive, inclusive environments that recognize the essential function of equity in the context of everyday experiences for students. And so I place these on either side for that reason. Yes, we have anti-discrimination. We also have a call to create a comprehensive environment across Vermont in all of the ways in which we create school opportunities for students to ensure these aspects of anti-racist, culturally responsive, and I would offer culturally sustaining pedagogies into our space. So these are the state frameworks that help us now walk into our district story. EWSD has an equity policy, and I'm going to share a couple components of that in the presentation. It was passed on June 15th of 2021. It was a long journey to get there for our community. We first engaged in what I would describe as kind of the acceptance of model policy into conversation, into passage practice that is so frequently our policy practice in Vermont as it relates to how we pass policy in public schools through school boards. And that process pretty quickly reduced us to levels of voice that were not consistent with the policy we were trying to pass. And so instead of trying to push forward with some of those old paradigms around how we write policy, we scrapped about probably 8 months worth of work with some really critical feedback from folks around why this wasn't well representing their interests, their experiences, their needs. And went into a much more robust process to ensure that we collected feedback from the voices of those most impacted by equity work. We used affinity spaces. We engaged people based on areas of interest and conversation, from looking at anti-racist practices into LGBTQIA plus affirming space, as well as thinking about the impact of socioeconomic stressors for families and what the impact of our organization was, where that kind of stressor was occurring. And in the end, it resulted in an equity policy that has driven our work for the last 4 years. I'm going to share a couple of important tools that I think will help you see from the district level what that looks like in the direction from the district, and then also into a couple of practice examples.
I think,
first-
Erin, if I could
Yes.
just also
Sure.
thank you and the people in our community who came to those conversations. As a longtime board person, and we had a board with a mixture of experiences, we were used to seeing things in a certain way and having language that sort of was how we spoke about our policies. It was deep learning that we all did together as a board, but then invited in a lot of listening to our community, and Erin was an invaluable resource to our community members, to our board as we were learning, tirelessly helping us understand things a little differently on a policy landscape. It's a really impactful way to do policy. It's a much harder way to do policy, but it brings about, I think, a more meaningful policy. And to do otherwise on something like an equity policy would have been a disservice to the very work we were trying to do. But even having been on that subcommittee, I needed some convincing as a leader who had been around policy in the traditional state. So
I think
it
one of the
matters
things-
the time that's taken, and I'm
Yeah.
grateful. Thank you.
Sure, thanks, Kim. I think one of the things that the superintendent, the board needed to do in that moment was be highly self-reflective and deep listeners of criticism, right? And one of the things I watch boards and folks who are in powerful leadership positions sometimes struggle with is feedback related to actions taken that create harm. And our ability collectively to be able to do that was really the only thing I think that allowed us to move forward in that moment, was to hear some things we were doing that were not working well, to feel okay about making a mistake, because we are not perfect beings. We make mistakes, all of us, and to then be able to hear the things that our community needed from us and listen and then move in that direction. So thanks for that entry point, Kim. I think that's important. Where we ended was a definition that actually is remarkably consistent with the non-discrimination picture that I painted in the context of the state, along with the purpose statement of your ed quality standards. You must have both. And our definition of equity has both. I hear a lot of conversation about equity of opportunity, and I appreciate that language. I would also say that I think that language misses the impact of identity-based equity challenges that we see happen in our data. How we know and understand our demographics show up related to outcomes and experiences, both qualitative and quantitative. And when we only talk about it in the context of opportunity, I think we miss the systemic harms that are present that I think we need to attend to. And so this body of work is an attempt to do both things. Both are important. We can hold both of those things at the same time.
And seeing the data, you can't unsee it. So seeing the data in 2020 that was causing pause and the body of work that was required to bring that data to the fore, because it's not always obvious in the way we're required to report, but our board had to pause. It wasn't about intention. It was about what is actually, what are the experiences our students are having. Data is a driver in these conversations, and you can't unknow it.
We've had this conversation in another forum, which is the importance of qualitative and quantitative data, this idea that by looking at the average, you hide the ends, and if you don't engage in a conversation from a qualitative lens related to the experiences of the ends of your quantitative data sets, you miss substantial information that you need to do good work. These are the areas of the policy. The policy drives goals. It includes an anti-bias curriculum. It includes defining accountability procedures and redefining those and centering repair and restoration where possible, supporting people while in school care, thinking about the role of community and family engagement, diversifying our workforce, a really critical part of our work, representation in school environments, which we know matters, how we celebrate and recognize traditions, both nationally, internationally, state and locally, as well as understanding our professional learning and a transparent equity lens across all of the decisions we make. I wanted to share with you through the equity policy the development of our Equity Advisory Committee, which has a responsibility to oversee the equity work in the district, and it is made up of families members, staff, and majority student voice. And so we actually had a conversation in that space where students' votes get counted twice before we were able to represent a majority of students. But now we have more students than we have adults. And you can see the leadership team as an important part of the leadership for equity, my office as an important piece, and then every school has an equity team. We have about 100 and I think it's around 110 folks who are represented across the district in equity leadership. Those folks receive 5 full days of training in order to lead equity work in EWSD and are also paid a stipend for beyond the school day work to ensure to provide time and space. And their work are these goals that I just spoke to at the school level. I also wanted to share that this body of work is highly tied to our portrait of a graduate as we think about global citizenship as a critical feature for every student who attends school in EWSD, and ensuring that through these areas of focus for our portrait of a graduate, it's an example of how the equity policy lives into each aspect of EWSD. It is not a separate it's not a separate office. It's not a separate person. However, it does require organization of a person, and I do, at the end, want to make a couple of comments about the importance of equity leadership in Vermont if we are going to live into the state efforts that we've promised through the ed quality standards. In addition, this is our RTI framework, and what you can see is the instructional framework for ensuring response to intervention in the Essex Westford School District. It includes 4 components: first, instruction of essential standards, formative assessment, universal screeners, diagnostics, progress monitor, comprehensive assessment system, the data-driven application of tiered interventions, all within a culturally sustaining framework of equity-driven classrooms. And so again, this is an example of how equity shows up in each and every framework that we create. As we get into the last part of this presentation, and I'm hoping to answer some questions should you have them, I wanted to provide a couple of examples of what this means for teachers in classrooms and for students. And we make sure that all of our teachers related to goal, I think it's goal A of our equity policy related to anti-bias curriculum, have a 6-hour training in order to be a teacher in EWSD to be able to audit their own curriculum through an equity lens. As an example of a professional development opportunity for both the explicit as well as the hidden. We're teaching anytime we're talking curriculum, right? We have our explicit articulated curriculum. We also have our hidden curriculum, what we teach as people every time we're engaged with each other. Looking to create mirrors to see self inside of curriculum and also windows to see others, and making sure that there is a reduction of barriers of accessibility to curriculum. We also are on the very beginning stages of implementation of a comprehensive curriculum that is centered on national, international days of recognition, state and local days of recognition, as well as religious holidays and learning about them. We're not celebrating religious holidays, but looking at making sure that students know and understand a variety of different experiences based on different religions from around the world through the lens of the days on which they take place, And so this would take me another presentation to describe, but it's been developed by teachers for teachers, and we're in the process of really making sure that we have, these are the areas that we do every year, these are the ones that are on like a 3-year rotation, and it is developed by grade range in order to make sure that we are covering a K-12 experience. And again, that ties back to global citizenship as well as representation and students being able to experience self and others in curriculum. And then we're also really trying to center student voice. You heard me talk about the majority representation on the District Equity Advisory Committee. We also have a social justice union. We use affinity groups to support conversations about topics of interest to students, and then also try to make sure that student school board members are well represented in the context of the larger body of work for the equity journey that we've been on. I could talk a long time about what Kim brought up related to the journey of the actual equity policy development. It was a difficult conversation for our community and a very successful conversation for our community. It took a lot of discussion with a lot of people with a lot of different views that I think shows up as an opportunity to truly develop a community of care around an area of focus. There are still people who struggle with the context of doing equity work in schools in Essex. That happens. They are always invited to have conversations, to unpack what we're doing. Our work is to always support the First Amendment, to always make sure that people are heard and understood. But we do have a line about trying to erase people based on their identities in this school district, because everybody deserves to be seen and supported here. So I hope that's been a helpful conversation to hear about how we see equity here in EWSD as an overarching body of work. I don't want to ignore the 2 promises I made. One was just to say that I do worry that the Agency of Education does not center equity in a leadership framework based on organizing toward that. It feels much more diffuse in that space, and I worry that that's actually happening in a lot of school districts around the state. It is very difficult to ensure this body of work moves forward without having someone to organize the work, to think about the resources, to ensure the conversation. And given the ed quality standards, I'm not sure how we get there without some kind of organized approach. It doesn't have to be a single person, but what is the equity leadership structure for the agency? What is the equity leadership structure for our school districts? What's the equity leadership structure in our independent school spaces? I think it's an important conversation to have, because I don't think we'd be where we were without a solid organizing structure to get us there. And the last thing I want to do is say thank you for being here on behalf of Beth Cobb, the superintendent of UWSD. She wanted to be here. She was not able to be here with you today, but I do know that she's very grateful that you're here. Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk with you about this. I'm happy to respond to any questions that you might have. This is a picture of Hiawatha Elementary School, one of the schools that you're not in today. And again, happy to respond to whatever comments you have or questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to give some public admiration for the work you're doing, because in our AP language class, we actually have an assignment very similar to the work you're doing. We looked at policies of like social medias surrounding hate speech, etc., and how those policies could be implemented to form an actual law surrounding that. And with how many nuances and other very complicated issues surrounding it, it was quite frankly a very difficult task.
Yes.
So I can only imagine the work that you guys have put in. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I will just follow up by saying that this is possible to do this with whole community approaches, even though people have disagreements about the work. This idea that we cannot touch this topic because of what is happening nationally or even in our own communities or state, I think is misguided. I think it creates a divide instead of brings us together. It is possible to have these conversations in ways that respect people for who they are and engage together across differences without harming each other. And I appreciate those comments. It is not easy to do, but it is possible. Thanks.
It's very challenging indeed. I am very appreciative of your presentation. It's very inspiring. And I hope in practice everyone is content with the product of everything you summarized here. I am curious around the curriculum audit you mentioned in your presentation. You said the teachers got an opportunity to be trained for 6 hours, each of them, to actually audit the curriculum of their field. I'm curious around who provided such training, by which institution or by which person, and then whether you have actually, again, or intend to survey the community, the students, around their experience along the lines of equity to validate or to assess your work so far.
It's a great set of questions. First, I'd like to give credit to Dr. Rebecca Haslam, who has done some incredible work in the development of auditing tools for curriculum with an equity lens. It's a comprehensive design that she also comes and trains every new teacher that we hire every year. So that's how I can say that I know that every teacher has received the training, because we do it every year for everyone who's new to ensure that we maintain all teachers being trained and keep it in the front of the work. It is also used when we make program decisions, for example, in committees related to, we just decided on a literacy curriculum, for example, and those audit tools were used, and we could put that in with the teachers. They all knew what it was. They had training on it. So yeah, that has been incredibly helpful. The second question you asked was about our data, and we do use a survey called the Youth Truth Survey. I don't know if you've heard of it. There are several districts using it. It is incredibly helpful to help us assess where we are. It allows for you to select modules, and they have a specific equity and inclusion module that we are able to choose and use it to ask our students about where things are related to their experiences. It asks whether they can show up as their true authentic selves with the adults in their school. It asks about whether they can talk about topics that are sometimes seen as difficult to talk about and newly have been tagged as political, although I have some arguments with that. And so we are able to see where we rate related to other school districts that took that same survey nationally, and we rank quite high as it relates to the equity and inclusion components of that survey. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I will also say, though, that we certainly have some work to do on creating a comprehensive environment where students feel fully comfortable in coming forward related to harassment and bullying issues, right? Our reports that we collect in our school district do not match up with the number of students in an anonymous survey that say they have experienced bullying and harassment. So we still have work to do. But those are some examples of ways that we take a look at both our own data around hazing, harassment, and bullying and that non-discrimination framework, and pair it with our qualitative data in the Youth Truth Survey to think about what story are students telling versus what does our hard data in the district say. And I think that's another example of where those comparative measures are important. To simply produce percentages of an average, it just doesn't get you where you need to be to really understand your system. And I do think we could still do more work on assessment. I mean, I don't think we have every answer to every question I'd like to know, for sure, as you ask that question. But yes, we do assess this as students, staff, and families related to this topic specifically. Again, it's called the Youth Truth Survey.
Thank you. Rebecca is a grand friend of mine, and I trust her work with auditing around the equity lens. She and I worked a lot together.
That's great. That's great.
I'm really appreciative, and thank you. Keep up the good work.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Put it in context for me. Thank you for all your work. It's nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
After you used the Youth Truth Survey, do you give us an example of when you didn't like the results and what you did about that?
So I'm going to stay with the one that I just referenced, was the fact that our number of students who reported bullying and harassment on the Youth Truth Survey does not equal the number of reports from students to administration, for example, of that experience, which tells me that students are not coming forward with experiences that they're having in the school. And so one of the things that we're doing around that is having a conversation. Actually, there'll be an article in our EWSD newsletter this week related to beginning to engage families in a better understanding of the definitions of hazing, harassment, bullying, because I think there's a lot of confusion around those words. We're talking about having some family sessions and student sessions, doing presentations with students about how to get support, and also trying to make sure that we are really consistent in our practices as it relates to training and implementation of the requirements of HHB. Our hazing, harassment, and bullying and retaliation laws are very strong, and I'm sure you all have had conversations as a state board related to their implementation and some of the things that come back as we look at data statewide and we look at the SIRS data, I think it's called, where we collect data at the state level related to the numbers of reports and incidents that have been found. And I think if we did a study related to the state, we would see a pretty drastic difference between the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, where we see what students are reporting they're experiencing, and then the SIRS data related to how many incidents of bullying are found across the state. This is an area that is in need of improvement, I think, all over the place, and those are some examples of some things we're trying to do based on the information that we found in the variation between the Youth Truth Survey and then the actual data that we have where we see a problem, right? So that's an example. We also, another area in the Youth Truth that we are working on is family engagement. That we saw a real drop in family engagement, especially after the pandemic response and the closure of schools and the lack of accessibility to schools for families. It's an area we need to work on and are building conversations into our leadership teams related to that, trying to figure out, okay, how do we create improvement in that way? The Youth Truth data set is a large data set, and it is hard to contend with how to choose an area to focus on, because there are many. So I could follow up with probably 6 other examples. I won't for purposes of time, but it's a large data set, and I think our focus of how do we use data in succinct and clear ways to create improvement is another area that is in need of work statewide, because we have so many data sets. It's like, okay, how do we make sense of them all, and which ones are we really going to try to make a difference around? And I really would implore Vermont as a state to ensure that we're thinking about demographic disaggregation as in whatever way we choose to do that, because I think otherwise we hide what is the real picture of our state and our student experiences.
I feel like we could have you all afternoon. One more question?
That's okay. I was just going to thank Erin for her work. And, I was going to ask a question about the disaggregation, because that was one of the things that I think we felt really strongly about, putting in a rule for the EQS and that disaggregation. And I was curious sort of how this infrastructure that you have already set up here maps to those new requirements, right? Is that going to be a big leap for you in terms of doing that kind of disaggregation? And what will be sort of your data-informed decision-making process once those data come out?
I think that we have, we have done some disaggregation already related to our most recent process around continuous improvement planning and the addition of the expectations of an equity focus in the context of that process, and took a look at our disaggregation. I do think that the structures that we've developed and the data sets that we have will help us walk nicely into both EQS as well as disaggregated data that we will be be continuing to look at. It is not new for us. We do every year, our school board has consumed a comprehensive presentation on something that we describe as our equity inventory. And it takes probably, I think, 20 different areas of data and then does a comprehensive review from a disaggregated space, all the way from things like extracurricular participation to discipline to achievement, and taking a look all the way through our demographics to look at where we see gaps. And we do still have at Essex High School, we have classes that are primarily driven to create some remediation of below grade level gaps for students and the demographics of students who experience those. I mean, we really try to unpack it. And so as I describe the structures, both from a leadership perspective as well as from the monitoring through policy governance that the board is doing around the equity policy and the expectation they have related to unpacking data using this lens, I feel like for EWSD, it will map nicely onto the work we're already doing. But I want to be very clear. I think, I'm here because we are proud of this work. There is a lot to do, and my colleagues around the state who have been equity directors using ESSER funds are regularly getting their positions cut. We are seeing a reduction of focus and equity leadership across this state right now. And I think that as you ask that question of other systems that have felt it appropriate or necessary to remove equity leadership because there's no more ESSER funding, that may be more challenging for them. And again, I think the design of leadership to center equity in this state, if we are really serious about this work, is essential.
Thanks, Erin.
Thanks.
I just want to make a few comments. Hi, Erin. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you.
Thank you for the work of Essex Westford School District around equity. Just wanted to acknowledge and respond to two of the points that you made I think are really important. One is how we think statewide around centering this leadership around equity. And want to share that those conversations are happening at the Agency of Education.
Awesome.
We are also talking about establishing our HHB Council that has not been meeting frequently for the last several months, and making sure that there can be an intentional collaboration with that council as we have those broader conversations. And then the second point is around data. So I know in our previous conversations, I really appreciate your focus on bringing together the quantitative and the qualitative to really contextualize our understanding of data. And also, as you mentioned today, surfacing some nuances that may not appear when we're looking at the broad averages. So I certainly have a commitment to that work. And as we think about that, sometimes it's hard for us to disaggregate to the level you're doing at a school district level, because we may not have access to that level of detail. And also sometimes when we're looking at statewide information, we may not have the population size to be able to report it. And that comes true with when we look at our NAEP data and others. Sometimes we're not able to see that disaggregation in performance. But certainly those are some things we can just have conversations around as we move forward. And had some experiences in my prior work around looking at equity and sometimes seeing very disappointing patterns when you're evaluating students that are taking on advanced coursework and after school electives, and unfortunately sometimes that's very predictive of certain demographic patterns, right? And we want to make sure every child is having those opportunities. So when you start to look at that, you begin to make different structural changes, right, to support those options for students. So just making note that I think that work is really critical, and that'll be something that we'll need to continue having conversations around how we do that well at a statewide level.
Sure, thank you. I do think it's important to be careful as we think about the ways in which we discuss demographics as it relates to the ways systems are creating outcomes for demographics versus centering demographics as a result of the opportunities that institutions give them. So just a little bit of a reframe on that. And then I also think that the need for a conversation at the state. I appreciate that that's happening. I do know that there have been several people who have sought to hear that happening, and I'm grateful that you in the new leadership that you're in are centering that conversation. I'll be curious to hear about it. The last thing I'd like to just say is that I do think Vermont has put itself in a little bit of a predicament related to the N sizes and the way those stack on top of each other to create invisibility of data as it relates to demographics. And I think that sometimes we point at the feds related to that, but I'm pretty sure that there are some things that we can do in Vermont in the ways in which we present data that creates visibility for those demographics in ways that they are currently invisible. So just something to think about as we progress.
That's a really good point, and that's actually work that we're engaged in with the U.S. Department of Education.
Great.
So there's
That's
different
great.
N sizes as we think about accountability, for example, for our state assessment versus N size for reporting. And so those are things we need to be intentional about because that information is really helpful to drive practices. I think the other point you're making is a difference between equity in terms of outcomes and inputs, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's really the input work that is going to be really critical for us as we move forward as well.
Great.
So thank you.
Thanks. Sure.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so
This
much.
was-
Nice to be with you. Have a good
Thank you.
rest of your
Good to
meeting.
see you again.
All right, so the next item are a couple of accrediting agencies that have sought recognition by the board. So Tom, I will turn it over to you.
Sure, thank you. So our committee met on October 3rd to hear from two accrediting organizations. Just as by way of context, accreditation is required for all boarding programs, either by an approved organization or by a recognized agency. If you do go through the accreditation process, approval can happen in an abbreviated process, which pretty much means that the visiting team report is treated as equivalent of an AOE visiting team report. Schools are asked to submit assurances, they're outlined in the 2200 series, and submit evidence of accreditation. To be one of the accrediting agencies, there are 11 criteria that need to be met. They're in section 2227 of the new rules. Organizations have to show recognized quality over time, have a peer review process that involves training, clear standards, published standards that are rigorous, a site visit, and periodic reviews of the school. They need to have a process for evaluating curriculum and assessment, the establishment of an equitable, just, and inclusive community, familiarity with Vermont laws, and agreement to share evidence of compliance with the Agency of Education. So as I said, we heard from two organizations that are well known to us. The first was ASNE. Sarah Wilson, their executive director, and Beth Friedman, their director of accreditation, presented. They've been around for 75 years. They are members of ICASA, which is the leading organization in this field. They merged with ISANI, the Independent School Association of Northern New England, back in 2020, which did not do accreditation, but ASNE always has. They accredit 270 schools in 5 states. 21 of those schools are in Vermont. They require an annual report of all schools that involve, that reports on enrollment, budget, compensation, the school's audit, any litigation, and any major changes in the school over that year. That annual report can result in a staff visit to the school. Their main process is a decennial peer review where they send a team of 5 to 10 members for 3 days. They do provide training for the school, the chair of the committee, and the team. Their standards are split into 3 categories: leadership, the student's experience and program, and advancement in operations. DEIJ is embedded throughout their standards, and they have a DEI practitioner on every one of their visiting teams. That visit results in recommendations and action plans, and then several reports. Besides the annual, there's a biannual report, and then there's a 5-year report. The 5-year report results in a visit to the school, to check on how they are progressing on the recommendations and to check on the action plan. That's a one-day visit. They do require an addendum for Vermont. I'll stop there to see if you have any questions about ASNE as an organization.
I remember, Tom, when they came to talk to us in the EQS committee, they were really impressive. And I know we talked about that addendum that was going to be very specific to Vermont. Can you remind me what's going to be in that addendum and how that's going to work? Because I know that was something you were interested in. We were all talked quite a bit about EQS, and that was really an important piece of making sure that the independent school reviews, particularly with an equity lens, right?
I'm not sure. Let me just check here.
It might
They
have been at the
they
ASME.
might have submitted it.
They may have submitted it and I missed it. Okay. Have we done sort of a side-by-side to see sort of how that lines up with the new EQS and the equity
So
considerations?
they do have a link here, the self-study and visiting team report addenda for accredited
Yeah.
schools in Vermont. And I guess I could pull it up, but the way it worked for NEAS.
Yeah, okay.
Is that was a sheet that the chair of the team had to ensure was part of the
Yeah.
report. They are items that the team had to look into for Vermont schools in
Right.
particular.
And I remember we talked about that NEASC had it, and ASNE was certainly interested and wanted to do that. I lost track of where they were,
They
and I
do-
didn't see it.
They do have it, it's a.
Maybe I missed it. Okay.
It was a link to on the last
Link.
page of their.
Yeah. Has your committee had a chance to look at that and see sort of the extent to which it lines up with the EQS?
I did, but it's been a while.
Okay. But it does.
It does.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks. I just remembered that was a really important conversation.
And I think this might be more of a process question, but the annual attestation, when that is part of practice, that is for every approved independent school, regardless of the approval through accreditation or approval through the traditional path.
Correct.
So-
The assurances that are in 22-23.4.5 and 22-23.4 are for also.
I was making sure I was remembering it correctly. So this is really because from the dissolution of 7,000, the rule series 7,000, which had named some accrediting agencies, some of which don't even exist anymore, we dissolved that. And then on our independent school committee, we referenced the standards to be approved as an accrediting agency. And this is our first look at these who are seeking to be an approved accrediting agency. Perfect.
In the last week, I received interest from 4 others that should be submitting their applications within the week.
Okay.
That was going to be my next question. So these are the 2 we have in-house, and so we're anticipating that more than just these 2 are going to seek approval.
And I guess to clarify too, in our process for approving those that we are going to ultimately say, yes, you're sort of on the slate, it's, I don't want to say abbreviating, but it's accelerating a process to approval. How does it impact renewal? Can you remind me again? Because I don't know if I remember how it impacts renewal, or Jennifer, do you remember?
Well, that kind of ties, because, so they're approved for a 10-year period, but have a sort of 5-year point where the ASNE will come back and visit the school and write another
There'll
report.
be a 5-year report.
So I'm curious how that ties into like the 5-year approval cycle that we have in our rules.
So all of the materials that, and this is going to be the same for NEAS, all the reports and materials that they, the acknowledgement of continued accreditation that they send to the school is also sent to the agency. And also there's an agreement that if the agency has any questions and wants evidence of compliance, that they will provide that evidence as well. But the 5-year, there's a 2-year report that's based on, the school submits a 2-year report, the commission evaluates it, and then sends correspondence back about the quality of that report. The same is true of the 5-year report.
So it feels like there's a lot of touch points between a school and, say, ASNE. But is the idea that, as far as like the 5-year cycle, that would dovetail with the 5-year period that we have no rules.
That's the idea.
Okay.
And it may or may not sync exactly, right? So a renewal that came up, let's say they're approved for a 2-year period or something, and the cycle is not directly in line because they had been previously ESNE or NEASC approved 2 years before that, and we're out of sync with that schedule. It doesn't preclude the agency from doing a visit.
Correct.
So it is an avenue to a more accelerated approval or renewal if the window within which the more recent visit had happened by one of the accrediting agencies is thought to be adequate to meet the renewal expectations for the agency.
That's always been kind of the understanding, because at one point, the Council of Independent Schools had teams that would go visit. So yes, this is a way to have an equivalent to the AOE visit done by an approved third party.
Just a question, will ESNE conduct their visits on a 5-year basis, just to confirm?
So they have a 10-year, it's a decennial visit when they send the big team in of like 10 people. But every 5 years, having received the 2-year report and the 5-year report, they'll send a smaller team to the school. Which is, the smaller team is about the size of a normal AOE team.
And you said that's on a 5-year schedule.
Right.
Okay.
That's at the 5-year mark. And then 5 years after that is the big visit.
And having gone through those a while back, they're very comprehensive. The NEASC, I can't speak to the other, but I can speak to the NEASC process, very comprehensive. The self-studies in particular are very valuable. And there are a lot of touch points.
I agree with you.
So I'd like to move that we approve ASD as one of the recognized accrediting organizations for the state of Vermont.
I'll second.
You looking for a second? Second.
You call for the vote? I don't call.
Oh, yeah, all right, so there's been a motion, there's been a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Abstentions? It appears to be unanimous. Okay, thank you.
The second organization was NEASC, the Immigrant Association of School and Colleges. They were represented by Cam Staples, the president of the organizations, and 3 people involved in the accreditation of independent schools, George Edwards, Edie Traina, and Beth Hamilton. NEASC has been around for 139 years, accrediting independent schools since 1929. They accredit 600 independent schools, 39 of them are in Vermont. They also accredit 600 public schools and 400 international schools in 92 countries. They are also a member of ICASA. This is going to sound familiar. Similar annual report of enrollment, leadership, finances, and changes. A peer review process every 10 years. The team size varies according to the school. There's always a head of school as the chair. Training for the school, the chair and the team, the visiting team. Their process is different. It's in their decennial process, there's one visit early in the year called the foundation visit that evaluates operations, and that's a smaller team. That's their standards 1 through 6. For the other standards, 7 through 14, they have a bigger visit with a bigger team. One semester after that foundation visit that looks at student experience, and that's the major visiting team. They do have a dedicated standard just to curriculum, which is standard 9. They have a dedicated standard just to include, not just to, but includes DEIJ, that's standard 8. They have a new reporting process for schools reporting on DEIJ, and they also have a DEI expert on their visiting teams. Same kind of results, recommendations, both major and minor. And then reports annually at the 2-year and the 5-year mark. A director will visit the school at the 5-year mark to look for trends, to evaluate student experience, quality of governance, financials, and their strategic plan. They also have 2 other kinds of visits that if anything looks like it's not either in compliance or looks questionable, they'll have a focused staff visit where they'll send staff to the school, and that can happen anytime in the 10 years. And then anytime a school has a substantive change where it could be adding a grade level or adding a new facility, they would also send a team to the school for that reason. And as I mentioned, they also have Vermont-specific addendums. So I'll entertain any questions about NEASC. They also have presented to our committee, if not to the full board.
Tom, is that addendum, the Vermont-specific addendum, in both cases has been updated for EQS as, or I'm sorry, 2200 as it references the Act 1 related changes?
So I didn't look at NEASC's. ASD, yes. They took, I sent them the 2200 rules, and so that.
Yeah. Okay. Is that, I know that we've relied on NEASC approval at our publics and independents. I think have some chosen to go through it, even the publics. Is that something that you could circle back with us, not to hold up an approval today, but that we would just have,
Yes.
you know, an opportunity to see the addendums as they're being operationalized?
I could send
That'd be
those.
great.
Yep. They're probably linked on the website, so it should be easy.
Any other questions?
So I'd like to make the motion that we add NEASC as an approved accrediting organization for the state of Vermont. Second.
Tammy seconded. Any further discussion?
I think I'll just say that they're familiar to us, and maybe partially because we did some work when we were maybe in my committee hats or otherwise. These had previously been something, I think, as we consider additional accrediting agencies, I think it might be reasonable to expect that we'll have more questions. I think this might be a function of our familiarity in terms of our, I don't know, due diligence or otherwise. I wouldn't want it to be viewed to just be a rubber stamp. I think we just are familiar.
And I'll say that our committee will have different kinds of questions with the organizations coming before us at our next meeting, especially around the peer review process, the training. I mean, all those criteria, these 2, as you said, are known to us.
Right.
Through experience, not just through testimony. The others are not. And so we'll need to see the evidence in their application and then ask more questions when they apply.
Yep. And
That's a good point.
And I think too, it's not predictive, unless again about this question, but I just think our process and whatever may happen with any other accrediting agencies we either consider, suggest and recommend move forward or otherwise don't, it doesn't preclude any of those schools that may be affiliated with those accreditations from applying for approval. Well, now they can't apply for approval because there's the moratorium, but it's not going to change a renewal process or prevent them from being part of it. It just may change what that process looks like from the AOE's need to engage and visit.
According to Pat Pallas at our meeting, there was only one other accrediting organization that was currently accrediting a Vermont independent school besides these 2. And that organization will come before us at our next meeting.
Okay.
The others, I don't believe, have any Vermont schools. They just want to be on the list, is my understanding.
Understood. Well, thank you. I trust your committee will be able to bring us, you'll have thought of a lot of questions and we may have more. So, thank you.
Tom, is the committee using a rubric to sort of track how it, track these key components across these different applicants? Because I think to Kim's point, these two applicants are really known to us, and right, so we're reading things that are familiar, but I'm thinking for consistency's sake and also sort of documenting decisions, like, do we have a rubric for scoring these of some sort?
So my process has been, do they meet the criteria or not? It's
Yeah.
not, so it's not like.
So it's sort of a
It
checklist.
can't be maybe, yeah, it's gotta be a checklist, it
Yeah.
can't be a
There's no
maybe.
three.
Got it.
It can't be a sort of.
Yeah.
Either they meet it or they don't.
Do we have a form or something that we're marking that all off?
I don't use the form, but I
Yeah.
got 22, 27, it's
Yeah.
pretty well bulleted.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say, they're responding to 2227.
Yeah.
So we have the responses right
yeah,
there.
okay, all right. I was just thinking for the new ones coming in, right? So
They're
if
responding to 2227.
They're responding as well,
Still
okay.
good,
If they don't,
If they don't, Tom says no.
And the other thing that I'll just mention is because these two accredit most of the schools that are accredited in Vermont, these were the ones who were under our December 1st deadline. And there's one more organization under that deadline.
Okay.
Which is why the push in November. The others have heard about that push in November and they want to get in, but it's not as critical for them because they don't accredit schools
Because they
currently.
don't accredit schools, got it.
Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none, all those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? All right, the motion is unanimous. Thank you, and thank you, Tom. Okay, next, we are slightly off schedule, but not too badly. I included in the agenda packet the final report on the task force on collaboration to benefit all students that was submitted by the Vermont School Boards Association. I recall that at our last meeting, I updated the board that I had a phone call just to, it was sort of an exit interview before the report was prepared, and then the report was disseminated last week. So I read the report and have prepared a proposed response, and I have to say, and I mentioned this in the letter, I think the VSBA did a really good job of highlighting where the board is and recognizing the fact that, you know, we have about $70,000 in our annual budget, a little bit more than that. We've been level funded for the last 3 years. We have some really high expectations that have been imposed on us by statute. So, and I, for one, have not been shy with the General Assembly or anyone. There are things that we, as we are set up now, can't and are not doing. So I think that is a fair critique that's in the report. There are some other things too that I brought out that I think, you know, want to make really clear. For instance, that we don't have oversight over the secretary. Secretary reports directly to the governor, and it's really the agency that has oversight over public schools more so than the board. So I've prepared this report. I'm happy to have a conversation about the report, or if anyone has any comments about my proposed response, I will open the floor.
I appreciate that you address the politicization of the board, but you put data in there. These are where the people are from. This is what their past experience was. I thought that was well done.
Thank you. Well, and actually, let me just because I went through where everyone lives and did a search, but I just want to make sure that I've accurately represented. I am the one from the K-12 Choice District. I believe that Jenna and Tom are from operating K-8 with high school choice, and everyone else is in a K-12 public choice, or a K-12 public school district. But if that is not correct, let me know because I need to correct it. Okay.
The other thing I just want to acknowledge is that when that change was made about the nature of the board and the nature of the agency, there was all sorts of concern at the time that it would become politicized. And from my experience so far, I haven't seen that, although that was, I know, a major concern when that change was made.
Any other thoughts, comments, suggestions to the report?
I'll just sort of echo your comment. You know, we have been level funded at $70,000. One of the things that we talked about quite a bit in the Roles and Responsibilities Committee was actually putting dollars with all of the things that we need to do under statute. And it's not, that number far exceeds $70,000, and we'll be sort of producing that as a part of the Roles and Responsibilities Committee back to the board. But it is noteworthy, especially when we have conversations around the fact that our rules are out of date, right? We are the regulatory board for public education in the state. So I think that's an important point to make. And I know you and I talked a little bit about this, Trevor. You know, I do find that the recommendation in the VSBA report, which I also really appreciated, it was very clearly written and concise, but around sort of applying the DQS to the board. I think, you know, there are certainly principles of good governance in the DQS, but there's a lot of things about the DQS that don't apply to the board, right? Because we don't have financial responsibility. But I think that's a really helpful suggestion. And I know we mentioned it at the end of the letter, but I think it just reaffirms for me that the work that we've started to undertake around governance and hopefully are going to continue should be a top priority for us.
I think I would echo that as well. And if it feels that it gets lost in responsiveness to that particular action, I don't know that I have any like suggested edits so much, Jennifer, but like in some of it, it feels as though we're posturing a little more defensive than I think an openness to consider. Part of what DQS is expecting is a self-evaluation from a governance standpoint, and I strongly believe that that is a driver for any good leadership, and I think it's an area we could look to as a model. I hadn't thought about it looking to it. I know that the VSBA had worked with the field to inform, and like in prior, you know, district leadership roles, I employed a lot of those self-evaluation, not of our board work, of our attending to policy and accountability to outcomes. And I think it offers a really good place to start, even though some aspects may not work for what we do, but more so that notion of considering our governance as an example of how to lead and create space for self-reflection. I loved that suggestion for us, and it's an example and a metric that exists, and I kind of missed it when I read through saying like an acknowledgement that that would be a good exploration for us as a board. So I don't know if you would feel comfortable being able to make that stronger, or maybe even lead, since it's in their executive summary, in considering board practices. It was an actionable item that we could either indicate we are curious to consider how that would apply for us and are looking forward to, you know, having those conversations with the board. It would lead us on an affirmative place.
So the sentence is, the committee is already working to clarify its external roles and functions and to strengthen its internal governance structure as suggested by the report. Do you want me to put in including analysis of
application of DQS to our state board practices?
Well, or perhaps, go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to say, why would we do that? Why would we name that specific piece of work and not other specific pieces of work as guiding our consideration? I think that we do want to look at it. You could say among other things, but I don't know if we would want to just, I don't know if we want to privilege that. Because that's a district quality standards.
So what would,
I was just going to suggest, I wonder if a way we might handle this is to say, we really appreciate the suggestion, and you know, we had not considered looking at the district quality standards as a potential framework that can help us think this through. So perhaps just acknowledging that recommendation as something that was helpful. It's already been thought-provoking. We're talking about it here. And, you know, I think I hadn't thought of the DQS as a potential framework. I think there are things that don't apply to us there, but to Kim's point, the self-reflection, there are things that could apply there, and it would be helpful for us to look at it. We appreciate the suggestion, and we can do that.
And I think that the sources that informed that part of DQS, they're out there too for us to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, could I mildly push back on that?
Sure,
Just
of course.
to suggest that we appreciate their feedback and that we're taking everything that they're saying into consideration and maybe not name it. Just throwing that out.
What are we afraid of with using a model that's being required of the districts statewide?
I don't think we're afraid, I'm not afraid of it. I'm just wondering about how appropriate it is to say that that's by naming one, I think you privilege it.
That is the one they named as a recommendation.
I think we can say that among
Yeah.
others.
Yeah. I think my thought was, well, I mean, it was a very specific recommendation, and from my perspective, I like to just acknowledge it was a recommendation. It's an interesting one, not one we've heard of, but to Tom's point, I think, that and other frameworks would be helpful. That was just I think, again, it was because they were so specific.
Right.
And there was several tables on just that, right? That was why I suggested maybe we name it specifically.
So I have something drafted, but Rich, your hand is raised. And let me just say, Rich, because you're not here with us, if you want to shout out, because I'm sorry that I missed you.
I just want to say, my board, the board I chair is a case pre-K through 6. But I do chair the SU that is both non-operating pre-K through 6, pre-K through 8, and pre-K through 12. So I didn't hear everything you said, but it sounded like you were listing which each of us represented or what our districts were.
Well, my question was, I have you down for being appointed from a K-12 public school district.
And I'm not. I mean, the district I serve on from the town of Dover is pre-K through 6.
Okay, so you are, I think, with Jenna and Tom.
Pre-K through 6.
Okay.
I knew I was in really good company, so.
Okay.
Actually, he's separate.
He's in his own.
Yeah.
His own category.
Yeah, okay. I need to figure out where I put that.
Which is kind of nice because we have a mix.
Okay, so you are K6, and then choice.
I also chair the SU that is pre-K through 12, non-operating, and pre-K through 8, and pre-K through 6. We have kind of all the different versions there.
So I guess what this particular paragraph pertained to is you personally, you're from Dover, so Dover is what kind of district? That would be
pre-K through 6.
Okay, so K through 6 public, and then is it choice for 7 through 12?
Yes.
Okay. And then that means that there are remaining 6 members that are K-12 public. Okay, thank you.
Back to the governance. Are we going back there?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have a proposed sentence, but happy to take more feedback.
No, does your sentence sum up?
So I think what I've heard
feedback, but
is the board appreciates the recommendation to consider use of the district quality standards as a potential framework, among others.
they're specifically saying governance. So
It's just that section.
it's just that section.
Okay.
So I think
Section
it's
113.
right. So it's very specific, and if you read these, they're not, as we talk about board self-assessment.
Really do
These are
apply.
really good thing. I mean, as long as it aligns with statute, it's not terribly off the mark that the board would use some of these as a lens for self-evaluation. So I think it's worthy of putting in there that we will consider or.
Okay. So the board appreciates the recommendation to consider use of the governance structure set forth in the district quality standards.
Section 113, governance.
Section 113.
You could just put period after that.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to add on, it's going to read, and this is the last paragraph. The committee is already working to clarify its external roles and functions and to strengthen its internal governance structure as suggested by the report, period. The board appreciates the recommendation to consider use of the governance structure set forth in the District Quality Standards, section 113.
I don't know if it's structure. I don't know if structure is the right word there.
Governance framework?
I would go with framework.
I would go with framework.
Okay. Okay,
Or
thank you.
governance, priorities, protocols, and processes specifically. I mean, that's the 3 sections.
Okay.
If you want.
That's why I was going with framework. It has.
Yeah.
My one other question is, you guys might notice that I refer to myself, well, I refer to the board as the board and it, because it is an entity. But I refer to myself as Chair Samuelson and then sign it as me on behalf of. So I could put down everyone's name. I could just put down my own name. I wasn't really sure protocol-wise. Didn't want it to be clunky.
I think it's fine as written.
Okay.
Thank you for thinking it through.
All right, so with those 2 changes, yes.
One thing that I think you also pointed out was that this is primarily a volunteer board. And I think it points out our system in the state of Vermont. If you look at as there's more and more to do, we have to look at, can we do it? Just like the legislature. When there's more and more to do, they're really a citizen legislature that's only there part-time, and they've got a lot to do. I'm not suggesting another study by any means, but just to highlight, and what you have, that this is a volunteer group doing as well as we can do with the time we have, and we appreciate their feedback.
Did you want me to actually add anything, or is that
I
just
just was
it?
throwing that out there as, I just think once in a while we need to remind ourselves it's a volunteer group, we're doing the best we can, unless they want to hire a full-time State Board of Education, which they're probably not going to do.
Yeah.
I think, I'm just going to say it, and then I don't know whether or not it needs to go in there, but they do cite utilizing things like the national state boards of education as sort of models for how to structure our own practices or how we fit in relationship with the AOE and our roles and responsibilities. And we aren't necessarily responding to that, and that's fine. I think it's a truth, and I think that we can become insular in Vermont in a lot of ways in how we do everything, and that's not just us. And I think not having that more national perspective on how other state boards of ed operate vis-a-vis their relationship with their agencies of ed or departments of ed or however they are structured, I think that's an action item we should consider how that fits within our statutory both responsibilities and obligations and limitations. Like all of those things play in, but in some ways we become pretty insular to what we can't do or don't have the resources to do. And I would just, I don't know if that's to be acknowledged in this response. And just in framing, I wonder if you want to bring sort of the positive reactions to the top of the letters so it maybe doesn't feel as defensive. And that might just be a me reading it. I don't know if others read it similarly. It just read a little defensive. And I think what we wrap up with then to say we appreciate that suggestion and we're looking at our own practices is kind of foundational for what the rest of this stuff is.
So I was trying the compliment sandwich.
Oh, top and bottom. Okay. No, and it'll be your style and your signature. I don't want it to get buried that we take the recommendation to come at a time that we are looking to do that ourselves as well. So if others don't see it to feel defensive, then I said my piece. So, but
I didn't see it as defensive. I thought there were things that needed to be addressed, but I didn't read it as defensive, but that might be because when I'm defensive, I'm a lot stronger about it than
Well, if there are no further comments, I would entertain a motion to authorize me to send the letter with the 2 edits, one being to note that Rich is from a K-6 public school with 712 choice, and then the second edit is to add in the sentence, "The board appreciates the recommendation to consider the use of the governance framework set forth in the district quality standards, section 113. So with those 2 amendments, I will update this and send it out. Do I have a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Thanks. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none.
Joe.
All those in favor of approving the motion, please raise your hand and signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Any abstentions? Actually, I'll abstain. All right, thank you. And this brings us to our break. So we're just a little bit off schedule. Can we try to come back at 3:45, unless a bunch of people need to take a break? To come back, it is 3:53, a little bit longer break, but I think we needed it. And so we are now at the point of our agenda for the interim secretary's report. So Zoe, I will turn it over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'll be brief with my report, but open to any other questions you might have. I wanted to share an update around the agency's Listen and Learn tour. So we have completed phase 1 and phase 2 of our listening sessions across the state, and we're moving into phase 3, which are our public engagement sessions. So the phase 2, we had regional planning with our education leaders in 6 different locations across the state, working with over 250 education leaders. Really productive sessions. We learned a lot. And now we are hosting public engagement sessions. They will start the week of October 22nd and run through November 7th. So encourage you to participate, also to share this information with your networks as well. This is an opportunity for Vermonters to provide input around how the agency can help to support the immediate and the future priorities for education in our state. And I'll make sure that you have the link to the website. We will have in-person sessions, 7 in-person sessions and 2 virtual sessions. So designed to promote broad-based participation, open to anyone who'd like to attend for those. So any questions around the Listen and Learn before I move on to the next one? Yep, sure.
So are you just doing 7 total? Like it's not, there aren't going to be more after?
So right now, this is structured to get this initial input. Obviously, listening never ends, right? I mean, this is an ongoing planning, but this is how we've at least structured for the fall engagement, with the idea of that work is really informing and validating the priorities of the agency's strategic plan. As we continue to move down this path, there are likely opportunities where there'll be additional opportunities to provide feedback, though this is what we have structured through the fall.
Okay. Thanks.
I also just want to mention, I did receive your questions regarding the independent schools, so thank you. We have compiled that for our team, and we'll be able to share with you written responses to those questions, and also to have a fuller and deeper conversation around the independent schools approval process at the November meeting, if the board chooses to add that as an agenda item. Yep.
I just asked, there was just one report that didn't come through, and it's possible Jennifer said it might have gone in with the questions rather than the initial request for information. And that was the tuition paid to independent schools for the July 1, 23 through June 30, 24 academic year, just by school and amount of public tuition paid.
I thought I recalled that being in the consolidated overview.
Yeah, I had sent it earlier on too, so maybe it never got to you. But that's fine
But you
too.
think you've already included that information?
Yeah, I think that's included.
I don't think we got the report, did we? I didn't see it. come
No,
through.
in other words, we've compiled all those questions. I received that
Oh,
question.
no, I'm sorry. I had sent it ahead of the questions as.
So I mentioned to Kim, I just
Sorry.
batched,
Might not have
sent
gotten
the emails on Friday.
through as when we were initially giving you our request for data.
Oh, I received it as kind of one.
The second time around
right.
on the questions generated from the data.
So we have that listed, so I've had that noted, and we'll
Great.
have
Okay.
written responses.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I was looking for July 1, just for the academic year, that was July 1, 23, when the Act 173 rules went into effect, through June 30, 24. So looking at that year of payments to independent schools.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I knew there was an easier way to say that.
We have
Thank
it
you.
noted. So as requested, we'll provide written responses, and then we'll be able to have that conversation at the November board meeting. Also related to, just a follow-up, we sent the board the fact that we are with the Inspire School. I wanted to provide an update on that. The Inspire School is a school for autism. The agency has opened an investigation. We did alert the board to that. We did respond to a series of complaints about the Inspire School for autism. That investigation opened in April of 2024. Our initial investigation prioritized confirming student safety, and after confirming appropriate oversight for student safety is in place, the initial investigation confirmed that there was reason to believe the school was failing to comply with several provisions of Rule 2200. The initial investigation also demonstrated the formal means of resolving the noncompliance would not be sufficient. AOE also found sufficient areas of concern to place the school on probation, which is a public status, and that was included in the communication that we relayed to the board. So beyond that, we will be able to discuss any alleged noncompliance in detail as the investigation is pending, and also, of course, out of fairness to the school and in due process. But when the investigation has been concluded, we'll be able to share the final report with the state board. So wanted to follow up with you on that communication.
Do you have a timeline expected?
I do not have a timeline. I know that it's an active investigation now.
Okay.
But it just opened in April.
Yeah. I remember when we first came on the board, Inspire was under investigation for the potential risk to not be able to be financially viable. It was a pretty extensive evaluation at that time, and they, in theory, made some recommended changes and remained approved, but to have them under investigation twice in a less than 6-year period is cause for concern. I don't know. I know that we got the notification of the probation, I think, is that what it's
Yes,
called?
probation status, correct.
Probation status, but I think, is there any convention that allows us to understand the nature of the complaints so that we could feel some satisfaction regarding issues of safety and viability or proper use of public dollars?
Yeah, so the general nature of the noncompliance is related to staffing requirements, really related to restraint and seclusion rules and IEP record keeping. So that's the nature of the investigation that's underway.
Restraint and seclusion, but those are able to be satisfied regarding student safety. I'm just thinking about continuing to have students.
Is the probation status, is that, it's in Rule 2200? Is that where it details?
Yes.
Probation status? I'm just not familiar with the role of the State Board of Ed, I guess, with probation status.
Yeah, we rewrote the rule, I think it was the first round of 2200, but where it allows the agency to provide technical assistance, but also gives the secretary the ability to accelerate right to an investigation, and if it feels appropriate, to put the school on probation. I can't remember which rule it is, but.
If I may, could I get an explanation as to what probation status entails for a school?
I can speak to, I don't have our legal counsel on the call to talk about the probation status, so it is written within the rules. So when we started the noncompliance review, we determined that they should be on probation status. Under the state board rules, probation does not impact the school's ability to enroll students. However, we feel it's particularly useful to use this public status for therapeutic schools since students are placed there by LEAs who have the ultimate discretion of where the school is an appropriate placement for their students. So the investigation is going to take place, and we can be able to provide some additional details when that has concluded.
So, but I think with your question, so probation is a public.
It's a public status.
Public status, LEAs are aware of it.
Correct.
LEAs still could send students there, but they have the discretion to send the child anywhere.
That's correct. Yes.
So I guess my concern is Lehigh. We've had a sort of pattern of a couple of schools having complaints, and in the situation of Lehigh, we were not even made aware that they were on probation, and then they closed, but the for-profit public dollars that the directors had just sort of walked with them. So we are experiencing a pattern of a couple of schools closing, Stone Path being the other, and now concern over Inspire again, a second time in 5 years. And I am concerned that holding accountable for either student safety or adequate financing or proper use of financing is only been becoming public when they're closed, and there's no more recourse on what can be done or what may or may not be okay for students.
So I would say next month, we'll be able to have a fuller conversation around the overall independent school review process. And you've pointed to 2 specific prior examples that likely have very unique circumstances that we can expand upon. I think for this particular instance, we opened an investigation, we notified the board, and it's a public status that they're under probation. So those are the facts related to this case that I wanted to just make you aware of. If you have further questions based on this that you would like to include, I would ask that you put those in writing and give it to us by the end of next week so we can include that in our formal response. So beyond that, in terms of other updates at the agency, we are moving forward with launching Read Vermont and we've provided 2 training webinars to make sure that the field is aware of the different types of professional development opportunities available to support with that transition to the science of reading. And forthcoming, we'll be providing some additional resources and tools as it relates to school budgeting and providing clarification around our education funding system. So we'll make sure when that is ready to forward that to the board as well. We've heard very loud and clear from our listening learn sessions that data will be very important to the boards and to the community in terms of decision making for this budget cycle. So we are prioritizing the release of some of that information in the coming weeks to support with the process.
Is that, can you talk a little bit more about what that data is? Is this like the statewide, what is that platform called? Like, there's a platform that captures finance data and snapshot and student data. Is that the type of data you're talking about?
So the snapshot is related to our ESSA plan, so for our federal reporting. What we're doing now is really triangulating a number of different data points to guide planning. So we first established the state profile report. We will be re-releasing the state profile report to add additional context based on stakeholder feedback we've had through our planning sessions. We also have developed regional reports to provide that's mirroring a lot of the data analysis of the state profile report at a regional level and also all the way down to supervisory union and school district level. So those will be important resources for the field. as it relates to education finance, it's being able to provide an overview to the public around Vermont's education funding system and how it compares to other states. This will be foundational for the broader work that is underway within the commission as we think about how to design a system for the state of Vermont that really is building on our strengths and is also sustainable over time. So that report will be coming out shortly to really set an understanding around our system. We've heard frequently that the education funding system is very complex, right? And so this is really trying to break down those components so that there's transparency. And within that, there are certain, of course, with any funding system, assumptions and incentives built into that. So making sure that that's clear as we move forward, along with just thinking about timeline too, on how we do budgeting. Vermont is very unique in that respect compared to other states. So some of that will be helpful as we think about short term, but also broader around thinking how we actually will do our budgeting process in a way that will be supportive also of what the schools need and when they need information to make decisions. Thereafter, we do understand we've prioritized a report around special education. So I know, have been hoping to share the state of special education with the state board. So hope that I'm not sure when we might schedule that, but this is really to look at special education from both a programmatic and a financial lens. So we've asked our teams to support that as a second financial report after we do the bigger picture overview of our funding system. So hopefully that helped to clarify the types of reports that we're developing and that we think will be useful.
I just want to say, you've spent a lot of time talking about reports and sort of compiling data, and every data point is the tip of an iceberg, right?
That's right.
It's a lot of work. I personally am very appreciative of the work that you're doing. It has needed to happen for a while, and I think it's sort of like everything needs to happen all at once, and I realize that puts a lot of pressure on you and the agency. And I just want to acknowledge that it is a monumental amount of work, but thank you very much for doing it.
Thank you. It's definitely a team effort. Everyone's engaged in this work at the agency in a really profound way. This is a team effort where all staff are really looking at better understanding how we can provide resources and tools that are supportive and are responsive to what we're hearing the field needs to help make decisions. And also, as we go into the legislative session, what would be helpful for the General Assembly to make decisions. A lot of what we hear as we're doing planning around the state is it's important to ground these conversations in data and research, and also considering implementation challenges. And that's where we can be a really productive partner in continuing to have that dialogue with the field as we move forward. Thank you.
It led me to think of the last budget that was just voted for some, or approved for some districts.
Barry?
That was the last one?
Yes,
Or the most
that was the
recent
last one. They're all now
Yeah,
approved.
I'm just recalling seeing students protesting or just like really out there in the streets trying to advocate for their teachers not to be laid off because of the budget, the money piece. How about the education, which is more important to them? What compromise can people do? With all the work you and your team have been doing along these lines, I'm just curious whether you have students being educated around the budget and how it works.
Yeah.
I find it important and necessary thinking of even families like grown-ups, whether they are multilingual, from multilingual families or even like regular Vermonters, how many of us have been educated in that lens, which again conclude it's very complicated. Talking about the bond and the paperweight, and it's super complicated for many people. How can we together maybe think of how we can better educate the public, and including our own students around these jargons and the process.
Yeah, we're definitely hearing a need to describe this in plain language so that it is understandable. And as we go into the public engagement sessions, we're encouraging students to really be part of that as well, to be engaged, and budgeting will be a topic that certainly will be discussed in that forum as well. But I think you also point to just the need for broader financial literacy and data literacy. And so those are also important considerations for us to have just outside of this, of course, one example of thinking and understanding about the budget. But yes, we're hearing that, and make sure it's plain language, easy to understand. We've been kind of describing it in terms of demystifying the education funding system.
Thank you.
Changing topics. I appreciated your email last month giving us some staffing updates, but my understanding is that there's been some additional staffing changes at the agency. Do you want to provide an update on that? Nicole Lee is leaving, correct?
Yeah, Nicole Lee has resigned from her position, so she will be vacating that position November 8th.
Right. And she's the finance director, or what was
She
her role?
is the education finance director,
Yeah,
yes.
that's right. And do we have anyone in our special education director position?
So our special education director was recruited to join a district.
I know.
And so certainly we're very sad to see her move from that position to the district level role. And, you know, I think it kind of brings up broader questions, right? If districts are able to pay significantly more when the oversight is around a much smaller number of students, about 1,000, versus oversight and compliance of 80,000, those are some questions we have, right? As we think about how to really design our system in a way that's placing the right level of leadership across the state. And certainly as there are changes with leadership, sometimes that's uncomfortable for the field because they maybe had a really great relationship with an individual staff person, and we're working to make sure everyone knows who to contact when these changes are happening. But it's also important to recognize that it's not one responsibility of any team member to shoulder the work of the agency. And so we're really intentional in the work we're doing at the Agency of Education to build team. Historically, the agency has been very siloed. And there's been a lack of cross-training across different departments and functional areas. And over the last 6 months, we've been really intentional about doing intra-agency collaboration and coordination and ensuring that people understand the different aspects of jobs within their division. Because before, sometimes when people would go on vacation, there was a gap, right? And so we're recognizing that as we're building the team for the agency, and certainly recruiting to replace some of these critical roles that are going to be important. Additionally, in some key areas, we've been able to contract with some consultants to provide support in building state level capacity, specifically related to education finance and specifically related to our ability to support literacy. So there's a lot of different work that's in play to make sure that we have a very strong team in place. And when there are changes, while sometimes that's challenging, it creates new opportunities for members within the agency to step up and take new roles, for members of the field to take new state level leadership roles. So there's actually also excitement around what's possible as we think about continuing to build out the team at the agency. And I'm really confident and really proud of the work of the agency. It is a pretty small team when you consider the amount of workload that's coming out of the agency, and we have really top-notch professionals that are dedicated. So,
But we don't have a state director of special education right now.
right now, we have an assistant director of special education, and we are in the recruitment process as we speak for special ed.
Because that position holds a particularly important role in our liaison with the federal government over IDA implementation and regulations. And for example, the NASD meeting was last week, and I don't think Vermont had anyone there, correct?
I can't speak to that, yes or no. I'm not sure of that specifically. That is absolutely a critical role.
Very critical. We've had a lot of turnover in that position in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and the agency received a needs assistance designation from OSEP. And prior to that, it was actually a lower level, actually a higher risk designation. And so our team has developed an action plan. We've worked with our special education directors to walk through that action plan and identifying the specific indicators where we were not in compliance to make sure that the field has an understanding of that and that we can support with monitoring. So as we think about also, developing the agency strategic plan, a lot of the updates I've provided to the board are around the agency statewide strategic initiatives, we are also doing work with Division of Planning and ensuring that we are focusing on those core processes and really strengthening the foundation for the Agency of Education. We have had a lot of turnover over the last 10 years on a lot of key positions, and so we need to make sure that we are building the knowledge, doing the cross-training, and the teaming that's needed for us to really be effective in our, not to say we weren't effective, but to take it to the next level, right? Which can be challenging when you have changes in leadership and positions.
Certainly appreciate it. Special education is a particularly important issue in this state, and as we've seen particularly around Act 173 implementation, we've had a number of different special education directors, and we do have a needs assistant, right? We are under monitoring.
That's right.
For the federal government.
I guess in that regard, and I don't know the answer, but in the absence of a named special education director for the state of Vermont as the SEA, where's the responsibility for ensuring that work is
No, there is
overseen?
there is an interim capacity for who is in charge and responsible for those duties. That is not, that work has not been sidelined. Our assistant director has been taking on those additional role. That's correct. Yes.
So speaking of reports, I only read what Digger said about a report, but one just came out from Picus, Oden and Associates.
Oden.
Yeah, that. And it talks, and I don't know, I guess the legislature commissioned it,
That's right.
and it talks about the sweet spot for districts being like 3,900 kids, of which there may be 3 in the state of Vermont. Is the legislature commissioning reports, and is the future of public education requesting reports, and how's that all kind of coming together so that it just feels like everything's happening and everybody's pulling in the same direction?
Right. So my understanding is that the General Assembly contracted for that report last year. It was released this week, and the commission is discussing what additional resources they may need to support the work moving forward. There was a conversation with the commission, and I'd recommended that the commission actually hire an education finance consultant. They didn't feel that that was needed at the time, and so made a decision as a commission to move forward with hiring a consultant to support public engagement. And so at our most recent education finance subcommittee, I shared that we as an agency have hired an education finance consultant who is supporting us with some of that work, and I think will be helpful in also informing the commission's work. But there will be broader conversations, I'm sure, with the commission around making sure that we have the right resources in play, in addition to what the agency may be able to bring to the conversation moving forward.
So the PICUS report was originally done in 2017. What the legislature asked to do is have those numbers escalated forward. So the models that are in there ostensibly are the 2017 models. However, the enrollment numbers that you're seeing were changed in those models. So this isn't a new report, it's actually an updated report from 2017 that just escalates the number that they had from 2017, but changes some of the assumptions with respect to enrollment sizes for elementary, middle, and secondary.
Thank you.
There's another report in 2018 that shows a very different breakout, right, for where the efficiency markers are for enrollment, right, and those sizes are very different, and you get very different cost estimates.
I guess, Lyle, did you have anything?
I'm done. Yep.
A little, somewhat in that same regard, thinking about the reaction to reports as they're covered, either in the media or otherwise, like that idea that we should be educating students at 11,000 ahead, which I think was one of the talking points that came out of the media coverage. It is difficult then for local districts to sort of overcome some of those types of numbers, or the 3,900. So all but 3 districts in the state will be battling the fact that they're not the efficiency model from a report that is covered. So I guess with that, I caution. You had mentioned earlier on that this AOE might provide some information regarding Vermont's education financing system, plain speak, and makes good sense. In comparison to other states, again, I don't know that I would caution that to be a helpful framing rather than if we did it this way, which I'm not suggesting you would, but as these things are received, the notion that there's some other model that would be a better fix then becomes the tide that local districts are swimming against when they are looking to bring information to their communities in the context of their work, in the context of the current laws, and what can and can't be done. So I really caution framing around, some other model, if that is not something actionable for our local districts to work with.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think there's two different components. One is thinking about short-term cost containment strategies that we would be operating within our existing laws and structure. And then there's talking about broader changes to a system to think about how we can promote and elevate outcomes, improve equity, and be sustainable. I think sometimes we conflate those two, and that becomes really challenging. I was at an event earlier today and getting a lot of questions around the PICUS report specifically. And so what the PICUS report is sharing is that it's possible to achieve better outcomes and spend less money, and that being able to improve outcomes is not always about investing more dollars, right? I think the strategies that they've outlined in the report are strategies that states have used across the country. And there's only a finite number of things when you think about how to achieve affordability. And so within that report, they outline reducing class size. In the case of Vermont, it would actually be
Increasing
class size. And other states, it's the other way. But looking at class size, looking at reducing number of teachers, reducing administrators, consolidating schools, and creating larger districts so that you can achieve economies of scale. These are a lot of the conversations that Vermont has been having for many years. Thinking about how that might work within the Vermont context is really challenging. And so as we engage in these conversations, I think part of what we need to think about is how are we defining financial effectiveness, and how are we really defining academic outcomes. If a school district's able to be financially effective and produce great outcomes, we're in a good situation. If they're not able to do that, then we need to think about the menu of options that may need to come into play to support that, and really thinking about what is in the best interest of students. In a lot of these conversations, and I think we need to acknowledge that change is really hard, and these are really, really difficult discussions to have and decisions to make. And so a lot of times we talk about these type of changes in terms of loss. And I think what we're shifting towards is thinking about what's the opportunity, right? Working with kids is aspirational work. It's about how do we give every child a great opportunity to thrive in school and be prepared after they leave school for college and career. And we are definitely hearing that when we are having our conversations with our education leadership, is that change could be really positive for some kids, but sometimes change doesn't make sense. And we need to be able to wrestle with that and recognize it. We also hear a lot for education leaders that, you bring us into a room and you give us, here are the parameters and here are the goals. They could probably come up with some really great solutions that are ground up, rooted in their community, that make a lot of sense, right? And so I think as we're hearing a lot of districts struggling to make these decisions, we do hear that there's a need to have greater kind of clarity around the goals, greater clarity around the tools that are available to support this work. And I think, Kim, that's where you're getting at. Sometimes the tools aren't available to implement some of these and changes that could improve academics or could improve affordability. And we need to be able to recognize that in the short term as we also plan for the longer term.
Yeah, framing is important.
Yes.
Because whatever comes out is going to set the stage for the conversations local boards are having in their local communities, where their local budgets will be passed. And until the funding formula is different, I think being very mindful of what makes that more challenging, or could be framed in a way to set the stage for unnecessary battles when the range of options really are not available to the people doing the work in the local communities. So it's not in the absence of also being aspirational in the commission work, because that is framed around the future.
Right.
So a report of current data and what it looks like in other states could be taken differently in terms of being actionable and what else would we may do. So just a cautionary concern. I know the letter that came out of legislative leadership last year caused a lot of budgets to fail, and it suggested ill intent almost, and I think that made it hard for local boards to do their job. So,
And if I may add, on the topic of framing, I think we have to be very careful with the Picus audit report. There's nothing in there that suggests that's causal, right? What Picus and Audin did is they costed out a series of what they have identified as best practices and then divided that number by some denominator. There is absolutely no causal evidence to suggest that if you spend at that level that you will get higher outcomes, equivalent outcomes, or lower outcomes. That report does not say that at all. And I think we have to be very, very careful about that framing, because we cannot go around saying, well, if we're going to do this with the dollars, right, we're going to get this in terms of outcomes. And that is not what that report says at all. So I think we have to be very careful with our language around how we frame that report. What they've done is they've costed out a series of what they have identified as best practices based on their review of the literature, and divided that number, made certain assumptions about scale, and then divided that number by a number of students. And so that gives you an average per pupil expenditure, but that is not causal evidence that that number will buy you better outcomes. But to Zoe's point, the real trick here is how to use those dollars. Right? And so the Picus report can provide some starting point for conversation about what might be best practices with how dollars are used. But we cannot say that those dollars will lead us to better outcomes, worse outcomes, or equivalent outcomes. I think that framing is really, really important in this moment, because the moment is so charged, right? That if we start down that road, the next headline is going to be that if we spend this, we get this, or we are inefficient now. We actually can't say any of those things based on that report.
It doesn't reflect the reality of our current population.
No, it reflects
distribution.
Arkansas reality. It's a copy and paste from the Arkansas report.
I think it's exactly what you said.
We have to be very, very careful with our language around this report. It's good information. It should be, right? Larry does terrific work, and it's great information for us to consider in this process, but we have got to be really careful with our language about it.
And I would say, I think part of our work with the Listen and Learn is, as we are having conversations, is how do you contextualize this within the Vermont landscape, right? That's the work, is if we just looked at a menu of options, we know what the menu of options are. How do we think about organizing and potentially implementing some of those strategies in ways that are going to really build upon Vermont's values, ensure that we're promoting academic excellence, and maximizing the dollars that we have. But I've worked in a lot of different systems that have variable funding from $8,000 per student to $20,000 per student. And so it's not always about the investment of money, it's around also the inputs and how it's structured and organized. So unfortunately, this work is very complex, and I think that's why we're having this conversation around framing, but being able to kind of name what are some considerations can be helpful. And the agency wasn't involved with structuring the scope of work for that study, but I think what I've read and heard from those who have been is that it was just supposed to be informational, not a policy, right? So
Lyle, turn
I
back
was
to
just
you.
going to say, I think Tammy hit the nail on the head, that they took a number and divided it by another number, and they said, you can now make this work. And even in the reporting, it said it was an academic exercise. So I think it was hopefully
And it's an
accurate.
update from the 2017 report, which was actually an agency report.
Perhaps my original point.
Yes, that was an agency report in 2017, and the agency rejected that report in 2017, right? And this number, a little bit of context. And so that report was rejected by the agency at the time. Yep.
And I
So
think my
I'm gonna-
original point is, I hope that there aren't too many leads on this conversation, that the legislature's going this way and the future of public education, education committees going this way, it'd be nice if they just said, take it.
Yes, yes. So at the Education Finance Subcommittee meeting on Monday, we discussed in 2 weeks we're meeting again. So the chair had indicated that this report, the PICUS report, was likely coming out this week. I had indicated that the agency's working on another report. That'll be our focus for the next Education Finance Subcommittee. And I think it's, a lot of meaning making has to happen, right, as we continue to move forward.
So at this point, because the next on the agenda is an update on the commission on the future of public education in Vermont. And we've kind of danced around that a little bit with the Ed Finance, which Zoe is on. I will say I don't have too much of an update because the last time the commission met was September 9th. And I am not on the Ed Finance Subcommittee. So I have not had a commission meeting since before our last meeting. There have been a couple of Ed Finance Committee meetings, and I know that we do have a full commission meeting this coming Monday at the Randolph Union Middle High School Theater. So it's going to be a regular commission meeting from 1 to 4, followed by the first public engagement session from 5 to 7. So there was a press release that was included in the agenda packet. I believe, just from my own parsing of the notes, that the consultant has not yet been hired.
That's correct.
For the engagement committee, but probably will be by November. So this meeting is happening outside of having a consultant, but I think once the consultant comes in, the consultant will be working with that committee to fine-tune those engagement sessions. I also know, as a board, we will be having multiple conversations about the work of the commission, but we're still kind of at the beginning stages of framing that out, because I think the last time we had a meeting, we came up with definitions for equity, sustainability, and quality. So I think the Ed Finance Committee has really taken off and is starting to do a lot of work. I think the General Commission is sort of poised to be doing that work, but we're not there yet. So I think future board meetings will have more time spent on talking about the commission work, just so that we can have a full conversation and you guys understand what's going on, and then I'm better able to represent the board. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that.
Just the focus of the Education and Finance Subcommittee over the last 2 meetings has been to identify the cost drivers and also to begin determining what are some short-term strategies that could be entertained versus medium-term and long-term.
Any questions?
Is are the cost drivers like now a finite set? I just didn't know, is that like defined and that's going to be the metrics that drive the rest of the conversations, or are there more things to be considered that maybe haven't come up yet?
So for example, looking at healthcare cost as a driver, looking also at really understanding how we invest in education. So looking at the categories and function, object codes in our budgets around how much is invested in instructional, how much is invested in facilities, how much is invested in things like mental health, which we at the agency have been trying to quantify. So those have been more of the discussions as we've gone forward.
Are you looking at the cost shift to the Ed Fund? Right, because if you look at instructional expenditures in the state, it's either flatlined or declined with respect to inflation. Social services have gone up, but outside the Ed Fund, the general, right, spending for social services have gone down, right? And so there's been this cost shift from the general taxpayer to the property taxpayer over time as investments in social services outside schools have gone down. And that's a regressive tax. So I'm curious, is that something you're looking at?
So within our Listen and Learn tour, we've been having breakout sessions around mental health, which have been organized in 2 parts. One is to attempt to quantify the mental health cost in schools. And then 2 is to also understand some of the supports and programming and things like that that are in place for schools. We are doing interagency work with the Agency of Human Services as we think about the type of coordination that may be required as you're you're describing, because I think a big takeaway that we have is a lot of the mental health needs that we may see presented in schools are a reflection of the community. And so there are some models that are showing some promise in terms of that coordination, but that's a broader conversation as we think about how, one, to support that coordination, and also then how to fund it are different discussions.
Yeah, I appreciate we need more coordination in agency. I was going back to, you were just talking about your data in terms of the function and object codes, right? That you can see that in the financial data, that there's actually been that cost shift. Is that a data point that you're tracking in your decision making?
Specific
for cost drivers?
to-
Because you were talking about drivers of costs, right? And that was a priority of what you're looking at, right? And so we know that one of the cost drivers has been the offload, right, of social services from the general fund to the ed fund. But I didn't hear you mention that one. And I also heard you talking about looking at the function and object code data. So is that something you're looking at?
So specifically, our work within the agency was trying to quantify what the cost to deliver mental health is on schools.
Right.
Being able to quantify that is very challenging based on our uniform chart of accounts and how things are coded very differently. So it's hard to get a good estimate as you're thinking about what is the cost on schools.
That's off the general ledger, but the transaction journal data, you can use that. We can talk about it.
Well, we brought it back to, we brought the metric back to the field and said, this is the metric this is the amount we have that we can quantify based on budgets. And I think what we've concluded is that's probably not a great proxy. And so there's a lot more work that needs to be done to actually accurately measure that. But Jill actually facilitated that particular breakout session. I was on assessment and accountability. So Jill, is there anything else you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that point, so we brought forth the methodology that was built with business managers. It produced some data using actuals, so actual expenditures reported in stat book, and then also using job classification codes that were identified by business managers. We brought that back to the field and said, this is the methodology, and this is...
Would you mind coming up to the
Yeah, sorry. Am I not projecting?
And then introduce yourself, Jill, please.
Can do. Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education.
So I'll repeat what I said. So working with business managers, we looked at stat book, which is actual expenditures, annual report, using the uniform chart of accounts, which brings us back to really 2018 is really when that set of function object codes were sort of standardized. In addition, we looked at job classifications. Again, they submit teacher staff survey data every year. And so working with business managers, we sort of identified which function object codes might help us to capture this at an aggregate level, right? So not at a detailed district level. That we then ran those numbers and that produced some data, and then we went back out to the field, discussed the methodology, and said, is this a valid way to approach this to give us a good approximate amount? And the conclusion was, no, not really. And the reason is that our uniform chart of accounts was never structured such that it can capture mental health as specific activities, and a lot of it is tied to special education as well, which sort of can obfuscate in some ways that level of detail. We also found, so this also is prompting work internally, because since the uniform chart of accounts was created, we really haven't gone back and really thought about how are we going to use this expenditure data. And so there is a need to, I think, create more specificity, but also then we really need some standardization, because the other thing that we found is that, like many things in Vermont, it's kind of 1,000 flowers blooming in the sun, and how one business manager might code a position or a cost is entirely different from another business manager. And in addition, they're not necessarily talking to the folks who are programmatically doing the work. So Tammy, to answer your question.
There is no such thing as a uniform chart of accounts.
Yes, that's right.
That's the fallacy of that.
Yeah.
Many other states are using their transaction journal data to do this, though.
Yes.
Right? Which is sub-chart.
Exactly. And so, Tammy, part of our intention here was that we have been hearing a lot, like
throughout the last legislative session that, you know, there is this shift to the ed fund. I don't think that we're actually questioning that. I think we actually have broad consensus on that. But what is the scope of that? How do we distinguish between a mental health cost, a special education cost, a social emotional learning? Do we bundle it all together? And we actually, I would say, didn't have consensus on that when we were speaking to the field. There were some folks who said, well, social emotional learning is just part of our curriculum at this point. And yes, it's meant to improve mental health, but I don't know if you should call that a mental health cost. Other folks felt really differently. So I think what we were trying to avoid, frankly, was putting more pressure on the field by asking them for a district level detail, let's go into your sub-ledger, asking them to produce that data, and in order to do that, they really do have to have the business managers sitting down with the programmatic folks, what % of so-and-so's time, you know.
But you're a Power School customer, right?
For
Not all
few.
are on Power School.
Yeah,
Not all
there's
on
just a few, yeah.
No.
And
We don't
also,
have a
again, though,
standardized system.
how are they coding things? Like, how are things consistently? For example, school nurses. School nurses are doing a lot of mental health support, but they don't code it to that, right? So there's a lot of work that's happening that isn't captured. So
Then I think the other question you always ask is to what end, right?
To what end,
So when
yeah.
we think about pulling all of this data together, what are the real questions we're trying to answer, right, is really important as we think about any other layer of data collection and refinement that may be needed. And so I think, you know, part of the conversation is, you know, Jill is mentioning, is it's not just one thing when we talk about mental health. And that's part of also why, as we do additional reporting, we're going to focus on more topical reports. And so we can talk about also, you know, special education and the funding around that and the patterns that we're seeing. We can talk about social emotional learning, right? So these pieces we're identifying need to be unpacked as we move forward. And we did, as Jill is describing, we tried to say, here is a methodology. It wasn't perfect, but it's what we can approximate at the time we are now.
And I think also, again, to that question, to what end? I don't think that folks are questioning the idea that there is increased mental health needs for students, that a lot of those needs are being absorbed by schools. We certainly saw a big investment of ESSER funds to support that. Those funds have now sunsetted.
Exactly.
What now happens to the budgets? So I think an ongoing question is, you know, one of the big increases that we saw between a pre-COVID year and a COVID year was a real increase in percentage of federal dollars, right?
Right.
So I would be really interested to see, what do the FY25 budgets look like as those dollars sunset, but the services are still being provided? Did they just shift back down to the ed fund, or, you know, were the services cut, et cetera, et cetera? So I think it's an ongoing question, but critically is we contextualize that conversation with, I think, a much deeper qualitative conversation, asking folks to sort of describe, right? What does this look like? What does this increased mental health needs look like for you? How are you addressing it? How are you measuring it? For example, one of the interesting things that we saw is a significant increase, order of magnitude increase, in the hiring of behavior interventionists and specialists. And when I said, describe that, what are we seeing here? And the answer is, well, we can't hire counselors or psychologists. They don't exist, right? And so what we are managing then is the externalizing behaviors of perhaps significant mental health needs or just dysregulation as a general statement. And it also becomes a sort of band-aided approach to support teacher retention, because we also have a lot of early career or provisionally licensed educators who are overwhelmed by what they're seeing. So there's a lot of nuance to this, and that nuance and the context is, I think, what will help us drive towards, let's look at this system, right? So it's not just about where did the funds shift. That's an important question, but that's not really the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to figure out how we have an integrated approach to providing mental health services to students, and a real recognition that what's happening with students in the school space is really a reflection of what is happening in the community. And so therefore it cannot be solved
by schools.
And I would say that's true outside of mental health also, right? A lot of the challenges that Vermont faces present themselves in schools, right? So the challenge of having affordable housing, right, is a lot of people can't move to Vermont or they can't afford to stay in Vermont. So that's affecting enrollment in schools. It's affecting our ability to recruit and retain teachers. Also, if an industry moves away and there aren't jobs anymore, those are affecting opportunities for families to be here in Vermont, right? So we're hearing all of that as well feed into this conversation. And it's really interesting to see schools are a microcosm, right, of their community and around some of the larger challenges that we're contending with as a state.
Thank you, Jill. I think you've got a good.
You can tell I've been saying this a lot.
Holistic picture.
Been on the road.
I would be curious to ask questions around moving forward, like, when you're breaking down services around like what do schools see as like tier 1 instruction, tier 1, what everybody's getting in the school, and then teasing out like all the way to like small group and then individual. And I think then you'll get a different sense. And I wonder also of how many schools had support staff doing tier 1 instruction in the classroom that no longer do that. And they have been moved to small group and individual.
Yes.
And now you're kind of, it's reactive, right? Because then tier 1 for school counseling, everybody should get school counseling. Nurses, like in the classroom, teaching, like there's good models around that practice that we've just annihilated through our schools because it's on the reactionary level. And then I would also be really interested in knowing how many schools are using outside providers to provide, and outside providers don't cost schools, right? Because like the schools are providing space and someone comes in and they're meeting with families or billing Medicaid for that, and but that's not always counted in what mental health support services that schools are provided.
Yes.
So
one of our early sessions when we were talking about this in a breakout session, one of our colleagues in the field put this beautifully, and so I want to give a shout out to Nick in Montpelier, who's their community liaison and is fabulous. And he described it really well. And what he said is that the needs of the most acute students.
End of the day.
Oh, man. I wasn't able to secure caffeine earlier either. Are often not able to be met outside the school.
Right.
And then those students are definitely coming to the school, and the school has a legal obligation to serve those students. And so what's happening is when you have those students and the school tries to do right by them, because this is what schools do, you then have a misalignment from the very top down because there are not the appropriate personnel to meet the needs of that student or those students. And so therefore, that's exactly right. All of your MTSS tiers get all misaligned all the way down. And so now no one is getting what they need being provided by the right person. And then you have to do a lot of band-aiding to manage the kind of externalizing all of this. And it's all really inefficient and costly.
Right. And I would.
That was a great description of the system, and we saw that validated everywhere.
And I think that there's probably a significant number of BIs, behavioral interventionists, that are on paraeducator contracts.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed. Yeah, and that's also very hard to tease out because paras aren't coded exactly in the way that we would necessarily like to be able to tease that out. So I do think that there are some strategies that we've started to talk about with our agency partners. We do recognize that, this is an integrated system. There are things like Success Beyond 6, right, that exist, that have existed. And so how can we strengthen or leverage those systems? And then also I was at the Vermont Principal Association today meeting with early career principals and assistant principals. And what they were really pointing to in a lot of ways is, how do we align this? How do we support the educators here now and keep them in the field, right? And then also moving forward, and I think this is what the Ed Commission is talking about, it's what we're all sort of talking about, is what is the role of schools? And sort of a recognition that has changed, since not all of us in this room, but the rest of us were in school, schools really do serve an expanded role. And so if we recognize that, we've talked a lot about the community schools neighborhood, and Zoe is actually an excellent resource to this. The community school model has a lot of promise, but it's predicated on this idea of like, well, if the schools are going to have to do everything, let's pour the resources in, right? But if you look at the Promise Neighborhoods model, it's sort of saying, and again, I'm going to point back to Zoe because this was literally her work and research, and I'm sitting here parroting her when she can say it better. But it's this idea of leveraging every resource within a community, every partner, to support families and students. And so I think we have to have that conversation. That's a longer term conversation. But I think what we're seeing is that schools are, as they do, they're doing their best by students, and they have a real dedication to that. And so they are just absorbing. We should have a conversation.
And that framing goes back to 1995, right, with the educational support systems. Vermont was the first state in the country who actually created a policy framework, right, to do that work. But what it's done is it's driven educational costs, right, in spending, because lots of that spending has been shifted over to schools, right, as they've absorbed. And so that's driving up spending, right? And that spending, the way our funding system is coming on the backs of property taxes, right? Not the general tax.
So let me just point out, because this, such a good conversation.
We've gone way off the rails.
we're like off the agenda. I am aware of the fact that, I don't know if Courtney is still.
I'm stepping in for Courtney. I'm pitching for court today.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't want to shut this conversation down, but I also know that board members might have to leave. So this is just a little opportunity to reflect. Do we want to keep going, or do we want to come back to this at a future meeting? Because
I do want to add one comment into this conversation. I like what everyone said, and I'm just going to remind us all, we are trapped in the system. We do beyond what we should be doing when we refer to the book in terms of pre-K-12. I am on the field. Every single day I can name a tangible example of something that I am doing at the school that has nothing to do with academics. Why am I doing it? Because if I don't do it, that student being graded to graduate is not gonna graduate because I have to fix the root of the problem. And to fix the root of the problem, I have to go all the way home, which is the first school. Vermont has become very complicated in so many ways. When we talk, especially when we talk about mental health. I've been here for almost 25 years. I can tell I know Vermont really well. My first years here, I could walk 2 weeks without seeing a black person like me. And whenever I see one, I'm like, oh, no way. So that's one example. I drove around here freely. It was beautiful driving here. Now, driving here is super scary. Everybody's angry. So much is going on. Maybe inflation, maybe whatsoever, drugs. We all know about it. So I'm pointing home being school number 1. Neighborhood is school number 2. And by neighborhood, I'm referring also to where our kids, our students go to hang out, or who they hang out with. Sometimes it's behind the neighborhood. Sometimes they go to a different county or town just to hang out with friends. Who knows who they hang out with? We are the third school. And then we are the ones to fix everything, to make our to really ensure our students are succeeding. And some of us are scared to go down to the house to fix the root of the problem. When we talk about mental health, it's so obvious. Most of it is from home, most of it. Then we deal with it. But how can we bring parents, the community together around this? Yes, I'm adding money to the table because it requires money to do this work. But that's what we need to do. Whenever we fix at the school, we are the problem to the learner. Because at home, someone else probably is not caring about what you're talking about to them. Maybe someone at home need to be educated around how to support the way we are trying to support the learner.
And maybe we also need to support the folks at home as well,
Exactly.
right? I think
That's
I read an
what
article
I'm saying.
yesterday that I think it was 40% of parents say that they have extreme mental health issues that are debilitating, right? I mean, that's sort of, as you said, it's what we heard a lot was that things are starting in the homes. And so that does then require a community-based, integrated approach to what we want to do.
Yeah, and some of this, it's not just to say we are the smartest people to fix this. No, it's just like there is somebody at home that needs some assistance.
Mm-hmm.
They are just not getting it. But we can try to provide that assistance. We know how to find that assistance to them.
Because Jill referenced it, so my research background and training is in place-based education strategies, understanding that education is also part of a broader community development strategy. And part of the reason I was so excited to come to Vermont is Vermont's focus on Cradle to Career. Cradle to Career really came out of the Promise Neighborhood Initiative of understanding that you need early and sustained investment across the lifespan, and that also includes being able to address community and health indicators. So we have a lot of the pieces in place in Vermont's education system, and as you think about funding, some of that is being able to create greater integration and alignment across systems that may not add money to the overall investment in education. So that is part of the discussion as we think about the way in which we're funding a lot of these components that are part of supporting child along their journey and strengthening families and strengthening communities and providing economic opportunities and upward mobility. It's a coordinated strategy. Collaboration is really challenging. It requires alignment of process. It requires data sharing. It requires, right? There's a lot involved, but I think Vermont has already made that commitment and there's a lot of key pieces in place. So I would anticipate that we will continue to have a lot of these conversations because this is the work, right? As the commission is engaged in thinking about the future of public education and building off of the commitments, frankly, that Vermont has already made and said these things are important for our state. But the connectivity may not be there in a way that we need in order to align, sustain, and create a system that's integrated and affordable. So I'm sure we will have more conversations this way.
Let's leave it there. Thank you all for a really rich conversation.
And once you get going,
It's
really hard to stop.
It's the fun work, though.
So Jill, we'll keep you in the hot seat.
Sure, I'm gonna grab my computer so that I can share.
Can you share from there, Jill, or do you need?
Yeah.
Okay.
They have a very fully integrated system here.
Great.
So. Okay. Bear with me for 1 second while I get everything pulled up.
While she's doing that, can I just say, it's nice to have that conversation, and because it validates, I think, what people see, hear, are concerned about. And it's nice to hear that the agency is quantifying those costs. And where then should that funding come from? Is it really an education issue and cost, or is it an Agency of Human Services cost? And how do you do that cost sharing? Because we're not going to stop helping kids. It's like, well, let's just cut the budget and stop helping. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. So how do we reshuffle? The pie is only this big when it comes to money. How do we reslice that in ways that make it meaningful?
Okay. So, Jennifer, you all have heard from us before on DQS, and you were mentioning it earlier. That made me very excited. I'm sure some recordings. Yay. So I have sort of the overview and the reminder of what it is. I can run through that very quickly and then sort of provide you with an update on where we're at. Would that be sort of the right
I think so.
level for today? Okay. All right, so district quality standards, Rule Series 100. These are agency of education rules established through Act 127 of 2023, which did a couple of other things. I don't know if you remember Act 127. That was a joke. It was the pupil waiting. All right, so it's applicable to public supervisory unions and districts, and then also school boards. It is not applicable to independent schools, and it's effective July 1 of 2025. Theory of action. What are we hoping to accomplish here? The rationale is that the state, meaning the agency of education, is responsible for providing equitable access to high-quality education to Vermont learners. Assurances are needed to support the successful delegation of this authority, and significant process variability in Vermont's education system has been exacerbated by the pandemic, labor shortages, increased staff turnover, economic impacts. We could go on and on and on. But really what we're diagnosing as the problem here is that districts have wildly varying capacity, fidelity, quality, workforce talent, and to operate their systems. And the way that we see that is that some of our systems are very fragile. We've seen that in very recent memory, but also that there tends to be, because of the scale of our system, a great deal of turnover that can then make us, even a highly functioning system, if they really don't have everything kind of nailed down, can really create problems and increase fragility as well. Okay. So what do we expect to see as our outcomes, right? Logic model here. Stronger and more consistent district-level core processes that can address persistent quality concerns, reduce equity gaps, and mitigate the impact of staff turnover. We're also expecting to see that the agency, by focusing on these district quality standards, will have an increased ability to deliver relevant technical support, right? This idea of bringing coherence, prioritization. When we're asking schools to do 1,000 things, we're now saying, do these things really well? This is the foundation for good systems. And in the absence of clear standards, as anyone who's an educator or a student knows, if you don't know what the standards are, it's really difficult to be able to deliver on those standards, and it's really difficult as a teacher or an agency member to provide methodical and effective supports if we don't know what we're aiming for. All right, so the district quality standards, you all actually did a nice summary of this for me earlier, provide new district level standards in business operations. There's actually significant work around budgeting, right? That's been a primary focus, facilities management, facility safety, and then governance for school boards. They represent critical, high leverage systems. We're not asking folks to do everything in these standards. We've really focused on what we and in partnership with the field really identified as high leverage systems that support equitable access to high quality education. They're focused on end results rather than specific prescriptive processes, and they're attainable for all districts regardless of scale or structure. So the idea here is that these district quality standards would apply no matter what our system looks like future state. We could have 1 LEA, we could have 100 LEAs. I really hope we don't have 100 LEAs. We could have 14, or we could have our current 51, and the same kind of standards for quality would apply. It is not a mechanism, as you all know, you've discussed this, by which EQS is comprehensively measured or reviewed. But I will talk about the EQS standards that are in there. There is a quality assurance process that kind of sits on the back end of this. We are utilizing state assessment scores, and I'm not just saying one, I would actually change that to student outcomes, right? We're actually looking for a more complicated metric than that as a basis for AOE intervention and review. That development of what that matrix looks like is happening right now within the agency. We're actually trying to align it very closely with how we identify like schools for comprehensive supports, resource allocation review, some of those federal level kind of requirements, so that there's some sense making here, right? And as we develop that, we're working with the field to really validate, are these the right measures? So what I'm saying there that's important is that we're looking at the outcomes of students, student achievement, student outcomes, not just assessment scores. I want to be really clear about that, kind of a wide variety, to be able to measure the effectiveness of a system. So this goes back to something that Zoe talked about earlier. We need this idea of financial sustainability, but also education quality, right? Those two things need to always be paired together. So we're looking for effective systems. The sort of process here is that every year, districts here means SUSDs, I just want to be clear, and then also school boards will do a self-evaluation, and we'll talk about the rubrics in just a moment. There will also then be that kind of review of sort of the student outcome and achievement, and paired together, that would then trigger the AOE 3-year intermediate review process. Districts are selected for this review from a subset of schools identified for comprehensive supports and additional targeted supports. So we're looking at those same kind of sets of schools that have already been identified using kind of our SSD plan and federal regulations. So there's really clear alignment, and districts will know, right, that it's sort of one comprehensive look. There's not two parallel systems. I do want to also signal that there are levers that already exist, and one of those levers that exists, so this question is like, okay, well, what happens if we go through intermediate review, a district is identified for technical assistance or needs assistance, we go through this whole process, right? There is existing in statute, as you all know, 16 VSA 165, that allows the agency to, recommend that a district undergo this review process with the state board. That would occur following the intermediate review process, technical assistance, if a district fails to take corrective action. That exists now, and we haven't really had to leverage that. So we're hoping that the same process will sort of exist here. But just wanted to call that out as something that is there. All right, so in terms of the self-evaluation, I'm going to point this out, and I say it every time we talk about DQS. There is no expectation that the first year or the second year, maybe even the third year, that we do the self-evaluation for district quality standards, that all districts would be proficient. If all districts were proficient, we wouldn't be having district quality standards, right? And I think there's some fear about that, but this is, you all had this conversation earlier, right? There's this real need to sort of critically look at your systems, critically look at roles and responsibilities, do a fair and honest evaluation so that you can identify areas for growth, right? This isn't a gotcha punitive. This really should be a way to, again, focus priorities. What are the critical systems within our districts? How are we doing on those things? So there's no expectation that SUs and SDs would be proficient across the board in the first year. You could knock me over with a feather, and I might, if everybody marks themselves as proficient, we might need to go back and take another look, right? And the same thing with school boards. There was, real anxiety about this expressed by our partners with the VSBA, and we really were very clear, right? Again, there's, I think 900 school board members across the state who are volunteer and all have other jobs and other roles, and so there's really no expectation that everybody would be able to meet these governance standards right off the bat. So it's really important. DQS proficiency alone will not trigger intermediate review, and this sort of goes back to something that Zoe said. If we're looking at a system that's driving great student outcomes and growth, then even if their systems are not fantastic, it wouldn't trigger this kind of corrective action intermediate review, but it would signal to us that this is potentially a fragile system, right? It might be a system that's relying on some really exceptional leaders, and if those folks get moved around, which frequently happens within Vermont, then that system might not be able to sustain those outcomes and that growth. So that would signal to us that this is a system that really might need some technical support and maybe some peer-to-peer partnerships. We would expect to see improvement over time, but unlikely to see significant changes for the second year. All right, I'm almost done with this part, and then we'll get to the update part. All right, so proficiency scales, we've done significant work on this, I think, since the last time we gave you an update. So we've got the standards, which are statements of quality, right? The proficiency scales are really rubrics. We decided to use a proficiency-based system. It's how we all measure our students, and it feels like a good way to measure our schools and ourselves as well. And we've generally defined that proficient, which is a 3, is if there's a clearly defined statute, that they're meeting that statute. We've sort of said that's a baseline for proficiency. And if there isn't a clearly defined statute or rule, but there is really like guidance, best practice that we can point to, then we've done that. But for the most part, we were able to point to statute or rule throughout. The criteria define or provide clearly defined examples such as methods or systems, specific quantitative benchmarks, or activities that represent proficiency. So I want to signal that these scales were built in very strong partnership with the field. And so what we really tried to do is, there's the standard, and then we would go out to, say, business managers or facilities directors and say, what does this look like? We found some folks who we believe to be highly proficient. We look at their systems and we say, those are some good exemplars. And we say, what does this look like when you're doing this well? So what are the activities that we would expect to see? What is the evidence that you might be able to attach to us in a document, right, that shows us a level of proficiency? And then where they really had fun was in advanced proficiency, because that's where they got to say, like, yeah, you have an operation and maintenance manual, but advanced proficiency, you've got this integrated amazing tool, and it generates a 5-year capital plan. They got very excited about that. So that's where we really allowed them to stretch and really say, like, this is what this looks like when it's really high functioning. So those, as I said, those rubrics have really been done in partnership. Education partners, administrators, business managers, facilities directors, school safety partners. We also worked with VSBE. Courtney and I attended their kind of leadership retreat this last summer and workshopped with them. We're in an iterative process right now. And we actually started from North Dakota's school board rules. They've done significant work in this space, and that gave the VSBA and school board leaders like an example how you might do this. And so we're kind of in that final back and forth of sort of drafting it out and making it specific and actionable. So rubrics are going to be used to support annual self-evaluation, and they'll be the basis for AOE intensive review. I want to signal something that was a little bonus that was added in the Yield Bill in the last year. There was, I think it was House Ways and Means added this in, requires consideration to include a recommended reserve fund account standard in DQS. So we are working with business managers to compile existing best practices. Turns out there's a lot of districts that have different standards around this, and so we're sort of working to collate those and then understand like what might be the proficiency standard. We would need to go through a formal rulemaking process if we decided to add this as a substandard or a description in the rubric under budgeting and accounting section. It may be that this is something that can just sort of be added in the rubric scale, or it might actually rise to the level of a new standard. So we're in the process of exploring that, but it was an addition to the DQS standards. All right, last part, upcoming milestones. So we are a couple of months behind our timeline, but we actually built in some cushion. So I'm not feeling panic level at this point. No, I never feel at panic level. But we are, I would say we're actually still pretty much on target. We're in the final edits stage of this is where we're at, which is always the persnickety bits that take extra time. And the folks that we would work with in the field and the agency, we're also all doing big ed systems work, right? So there's a need to sort of balance and prioritize. We may have potential rulemaking regarding the reserve fund amendment in December. So our plan is to have all of the rubrics done and be able to share out, again, with kind of the large stakeholder groups, right? This is the work that you've contributed to, this is how it all ties together. Get those final comments and edits from sort of the whole, you know, the VSA, VSBE, like the whole organizations. How do these work together? Do we have a matching of scale? Are these kind of comparable across all of the different standards? And that, we're aiming for that to be done by December. We also are really, we've begun this work, but we need to accelerate this work around the integration of the selected EQS standards, and really do the same kind of thing. So taking the EQS standard and then describing it through the proficiency scales in very actionable terms. What would this look like if we walked into a classroom, right? What does this look like in terms of student product? What does this look like? What is a high quality instructional material? What are its elements, right? So we're going to be doing that work. And then in the winter and spring, we're going to be developing a reporting dashboard for that first year self-evaluation, which is July 2025. So I'm actually very pleased to say that I think we're on track with this very big, complicated work. And I think it's really a model of the way that, you know, one of my mottos is like when we implement a big thing is to check with the field if we're going to break something before we do it, right? And I think that this has been a real model of how we can have a big new set of standards that can actually be integrated into the work that they already do in a way that makes sense and won't break something. But it gives us the ability to set a standard. We have a theory of action. What do we expect to see over time? To measure it and then to adjust, right? It's very much that continuous improvement cycle that we don't, I think as a state, Vermont, we tend to be challenged with fidelity of implementation, right? And I think by having these standards, this will provide us with an opportunity to actually really implement with fidelity and then measure as we go along. So that is where we're at. Any questions?
Jill, I was
turn it off now that I'm like done sharing.
Jill, I was writing down just a couple of notes that you were, as you were talking, just to make sure we could highlight and see if you can expand on one area. So definitely as we're setting these standards, there's intentionality about increasing the rigor.
Yes.
Right, so setting high expectations. And that this process has a lot of utility for multiple different federal programs and requirements along with other reporting. And the other piece too is as an accountability tool, if you could expand on how this process will help the agency proactively differentiate and target support to districts.
Yes.
Before they're at a point of being in an operational failure posture,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So if you could share
We've
that.
talked a lot about, Zoe, that a lot of times we tend to know what are the districts we've kind of got our eye on, right? Like, ooh, they had a lot of turnover in their central office last year, or they have a new superintendent and a new business manager, you know, or they've had a lot of stresses because of X, Y, or Z this year, right? And I think agency staff tend to sort of know that, but it's anecdotal, it's not systematized, and the ones that really worry are the ones you don't hear from because they're so underwater that they can't even raise their hand, right? It's like that drowning person, right? They're not thrashing around. They're just sort of blub blub underwater. And we really kind of experienced that in the past year with a district that really went underwater and wasn't able to raise their hand until they were really at a crisis point. And so having these kinds of measures is one way that we can kind of have that like sort of check-in every year, right? What are the systems that we should be looking at? But then also, it will help the agency tremendously to be able to prioritize high leverage supports, right? And also, again, help districts focus on high leverage activities and systems, right? And you'll see in the rubrics, like, it's not the glamorous part of the rubric, but if you look at things like regulatory compliance, it's referring back to like the basic standards of federal and state compliance. We just point to it. We don't have to invent a new standard. It's, are you doing those things, right? And there's ways to demonstrate that they're doing those things. So we're not adding more, we're describing what exists and making it into a clear system for support. So I'd say I'm excited about this work. I really think that this is work that's been done really well and effectively, and really shows like the power of this collaboration and partnership, and leveraging subject matter experts and practitioners across the field. And I'm really hoping that it can become a model for some of the sort of more complicated work, which is a lot of the EQS, right? Like, how do we measure EQS? This might be a really good model for us to look at. And we're going to kind of pilot that with a few of the EQS standards.
Questions?
Good work. It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, this
I
one
know the
actually-
field's really anxious about the self-evaluation.
Yeah.
So, and I know you're working on it. As soon as
gonna
they can,
keep-
as soon as they can get a look at those rubrics, I think that's
Yeah.
where their pinch point is. But I know you're working on them.
Yeah, and I think that
I think
like,
that's sort of the black box out
Yeah.
there right now.
yeah, and we're going to keep hammering on that idea, like that this is not a punitive measure. This is self-identification of your own systems so that we can direct support, and also really helping to identify, I think that the field does this informally, but we can actually help to support this, which is sort of matchmaking, right? So it looks like you're really struggling in this area. You've self-identified, hey, this district does this really, really well. They've been solid on this for years. Let's get you all talking, right? Because we don't know all of the stuff that they know in the field. I think it's just a way to make that more streamlined and efficient, so.
This is a great idea. I was thinking about that today during Erin's presentation. Right. So you've got a district here that does X really well, right?
Do you know
Like-
that as she was giving that presentation, I literally got an email that another district is like putting out a model policy for equity.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like, I wonder if they talked, but I was like, the timing's amazing there. So.
Yeah, no, that's
This is-
great.
We have one of those tools when I first came on board and we were working with our leadership team is like, what do we have in terms of identifying visibility to the overall operational well-being and educational quality of our system? And so I'm really encouraged by this work and really believe that it will be leveraged effectively by the agency to help to strengthen our system and to support and identify also best practices that can be leveraged and scaled, and that the agency can, with that statewide visibility, have a role in facilitating that type of connectivity and collaboration to share some really great work that's happening in the field that can be elevated and support other districts.
I think that's also part of it is like, we are talking a lot about sort of the like fragility and the weakness and the loss, but like there are systems that are very
Yes.
effective. Like you heard from
Oh,
Erin
yeah.
today, like
Yeah.
that was frankly inspirational work from where I was sitting, and incredibly labor intensive and takes a real commitment. And like we need to celebrate that. And like, you know, business operations is not the most glamorous thing that we
Oh, come
celebrate
on.
in schools. But, oh man, so critical, right? And to be able to highlight really effective
Yeah.
systems, I think that's also, you know, I was saying this to the principals and assistant principals today. I think we are in a crisis point. We've been through the pandemic, which was also hard, and we came sort of out of that, and we're still living with the legacy, and we're immediately into the next thing. But I do always, coming from out of state, right, and being in the high school that I taught in for a year was in a community where they did not value education. They did not value educators. They did not value their school. They were suspicious of their school. There was a lot of tension, and I always want to like celebrate what is in Vermont. And I think that sometimes we forget or don't realize the sort of incredible nature of the deep commitment to education in this state is
Yeah,
sort of
it's amazing.
extraordinary. It's like baked in to the values of
Constitution.
this
Yeah.
state in ways that are really incredible. And so we also want to celebrate what's really strong about our system and what we value. And like, I have kids in this system, and I love my schools. They're amazing. You know, I love my educators. They're amazing. I love my business managers. They're amazing people. So we also want to use this as a way to identify what's working really well.
I have to say, your enthusiasm is infectious.
I mean, Zoe and I are still laughing
At the end of the day, like
Friday at 6
Friday at
p.m.,
6.
which is so we were meeting with someone, they're like, I can't believe you guys are still smiling.
Yeah, it's the right work, right?
It's the right work.
This is
This is why we got into it.
Yeah, I mean, this is the enthusiasm of the agency. I mean, this is what's happening, is really engaging around this important critical work, thinking about how we leverage the expertise of all of our team members in doing the big work, right? And it's challenging, but it's also incredibly motivating, and being able to wake up every day with the opportunity to support the needs of students in Vermont across their state. I mean, it's a really powerful motivator. There's a lot of exciting work happening, so.
Yeah, well, and I think too, just sort of looking back on, what we've heard is that, the agency was not really accessible to local districts. And, I think about the agency's tagline, listen, learn, lead. And this really does seem to be putting you guys in the position that, districts have wanted.
Yes.
In a way that I think will be really helpful.
Yeah,
We're definitely hearing that from the
those
field.
regional sessions were really powerful, and having so many agency staff involved in that was really great. I think for everyone. I think it was great for the agency. I think it was great for the field to see us out there. And I keep sort of going like, we listened, we learned, like come back and like we're making a change or we're making an adjustment. They need to hear that, right? And I do think, Zoe and I talk about this a lot, that, with COVID, we really kind of pulled back by necessity, but I think that we will be seeing a lot more engagement in the field, and they want us to be engaged and out in the field, and I love it. Like, sitting in the office is not inspirational. Like, getting to walk through a school is like, it's my favorite thing. And so I love being out there. I know Zoe does as well.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
agency staff love it.
Yeah, it has been a road show, and I may not have made that clear, but this was about agency staff being in the field. It wasn't just me and Jill out there on the road. It was really an entire organization-wide effort, and it's really exciting to see things coming together, and for all of us to be able to hear the same things, and then bring all the agency staff back together and say, here's what we heard. Here's what we can do to respond, here are the next steps. So there's a lot of really exciting momentum as we're building.
And we have to do it over and over again.
Yeah.
Right? Not a one-off, not a you just saw us for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Like over and over again, we need to be there and present and listening and learning. So I think we're doing that.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so this takes us to future meeting planning. I have a long list. We are going to be in person at St. Johnsbury in November because this will be our time to go to Jenna's, because Jenna was also transitioning off the board in February, so this will be our time to go to her school and be there. So we'll have a tour. Well, let me pause there. I would like to take a straw poll as to whether board members feel that the school tour is beneficial to, our purposes at the State Board of Ed. Only because it is a lot to plan, and I realize that it makes for a very long day by the time you travel, do the tour, do lunch, do the afternoon meeting.
I would say yes for the board to do a tour because the campus is very different from any other place we've been.
Are we touring St. J Academy? Then yeah, I would definitely want to tour there.
I would like the school we go to.
I'm with you. I just wanted to check because it does, ask Maureen and Suzanne to do a fair amount of logistics as well as the school, so we will stick with that plan. Okay, so we will be at St. Johnsbury. We'll do the tour, do the lunch, do the meeting. We'll fine-tune the details. This is what I have on my list, and I am reasonably sure that we are not going to get to all of it. We would invite some sort of presentation by St. Johnsbury, as we did today. We should be getting an updated annual report from the Special Education Advisory Panel. There might be another 2,200, accrediting agency that might come before the board for recognition. We'll have another Roles and Responsibilities Committee update, another commission update. We may have an amendment to Articles of Agreement for an Interstate Compact Commission. We also might have a waiver from North Country that may come through in November. We will also have the discussion with the agency about the technical assurance forms.
Yes.
And I also have on my list, State of the State, special education, array of literacy programs and portrait of an adult learner. Those are not high priority items that need to happen in November, but they do need to happen because that is part of our charge under 16 VSA 164. So it would be good to have that background. So, yes.
The last one is a high priority. I mean, from the field.
Okay.
Honestly speaking.
Yeah. So my only concern here is really trying to fit this into a meeting that won't have us going through dinner.
Which one is a high priority for the field? Just.
I mean, the adult graduation.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's really complicated. I mean,
It is.
Many districts are struggling around even clear guidance on. I mean, there are some great ideas out there of how to do the work, but it's
we're
just
engaging.
we do not have a shared.
Great example of how we need to update the rules.
Thank you, exactly.
And it's also possible that we
Yeah.
might be able to start our meeting earlier than we did today. 1:30 was kind of the earliest that we could start our meeting, but if we can start earlier, we could have more time to do things. So, to be determined. Did I miss anything?
I would just almost check, like, this special ed advisory panel and State of the State on SPED, maybe. If you know the advisory panel is ready, then maybe that's one meeting and the State of the State on special ed is the next. Or maybe there's a synergy to having them together, I'm not exactly sure. And I think the technical assistance form, I think it's a broader independent school discussion because we had questions that were more than just the form and requests for data that was more than just the form. So I don't want to limit the scope of that conversation in response to the questions that you guys got.
Yeah, and that's how we framed our initial packet to you, was that it was a broader discussion, and that's why we had a description around what was included. So the intent would be for us to have a fuller conversation around the independent school and review process that would address all of the questions submitted.
Thanks.
And we could have as many as 4
Okay.
organizations.
Okay.
And can I just double check on, is there a timing deadline for those?
Only for one,
Okay.
I believe, just one.
Meaning that it would be too late to do it in December.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Because it's December 1 deadline.
Got it.
All right. I'm not hearing anything further. I don't know if there are any members of the public who wish to be heard, but if you do, you could raise your hand, or if you're in the audience and wish to say anything.
I just want to say thank you all for being here at Essex. I'm sorry I had work in Boston today. I'm Robert Carper. I'm the board chair here at Essex.
Oh, thank you.
Having us.
Everyone. Great to have you all here. Thank you for taking time to be here at Essex today. And I just want to say on behalf of the board, we're excited to collaborate with everyone. There's a lot of opportunities in Vermont in education in the next couple of years. So excited to collaborate with you all. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you very much for hosting us, because I think, I speak for everyone when I say we had a really great day here. The school is amazing, lots of opportunities for your students, and this was terrific. Thank you.
Thank you to Marlon for being here all day with us. Another board member.
Any other comments from members of the public? I'm not seeing any. So with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Lyle, seconded by Tammy, or sorry, Kim.
I didn't second.
Kim. All those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye.
Well, Kim got it.
All right, we stand in adjournment.
I will look that up for you.
Thank you.
On the,